Okay then. Hello and welcome to episode 124 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Pannobhasa. And I'm sitting here wearing this cozy robe because my woman wants me to wear a cozy robe. I came out wearing a sweater. She said, you need to wear the cozy robe. It's a Christmas video. Christmas is coming up. We're not Buddhists, but we are Buddhists. We're not Christians. Doesn't matter. Christianity has almost nothing to do with Christmas anymore, it seems like. So I put the cozy robe on over the top of the cozy sweater, and then she pointed out that I'd be sweating like the proverbial Arab. So then I had to switch and take off the cozy sweater and put the cozy robe back on. And see, this is the kind of work I have to do to make these videos. So I suppose I could mention that this is not the first Q&A I've done with Christmas tree behind me. I remember one time, it was a couple years ago, I was doing a Christmas video with a Christmas tree behind me. Might have been the same Christmas tree, because in South Carolina, apparently they do not sell real Christmas trees. It's weird. I never had a fake Christmas tree until I moved to South Carolina. In the Pacific Northwest, you go out and you chop down a real tree, or at the very least, you go and buy a real tree from some lot that has real trees all around, But here, I've never seen a real tree for sale. I assume they have them somewhere, or maybe on the black market or something. You go into like the Hispanic quarter or something, you might be able to find a real tree, like, behind somebody's trailer for sale or something. So anyways, I was sitting in front of that tree, and there was like this cream-colored whippet that was resting on a chair behind me. Her name was Fallon. I inherited her when I got my woman. My woman was part of a package deal. I got 2 whippets along with her, which was it was a bargain I could not pass up. And we no longer have that whippet because it turned out one day I drive to work at the sheet metal shop where I no longer work. And as soon as I get into the parking lot, I get this text: you got to come back home. Saffron has to be taken to the vet. So I rush in, tell the boss I'm going to be late, go back home. And what happened was these 2 whippets, they're both female. They were constantly rivals for the affection of the humans. And both of them wanted to be the favorite whippet. And both of them went into heat at the same time. And they're all doped up on female hormones. And they go outside to go pee. And Fallon, the cream-colored one, which was usually the passive one, literally tried to kill Saffron and just ripped this gash like 6 inches long in Fallon's neck. Just barely missed the jugular vein or the carotid artery or whatever would have killed her there. So we got rid of that whippet. And so now we got 1 whippet left, which is a total digression. See, I'm digressing before we even start answering questions. And so I guess I should start answering questions after showing the beverage, emergency backup beverage, and also after I give this message from my sponsor. Ever since I started using Dr. Squatch brand soap, my complexion is so goddamn supple you wouldn't believe it. Just kidding. Fuck Dr. Squatch. I don't even use soap. But the thing is, it really kind of bothers me a little bit. Kind of saddens me. I'm not mad. I'm just kind of disappointed that so many people that are on YouTube have started selling shit on their videos. Even Styx Hexenhammer 666, who has steadfastly refused to monetize his videos, is now all of a sudden selling beef jerky and mushroom pills on his videos. And his friend Jeremy the Quartering, as much as 1/3 of his video can consist of him trying to sell you coffee. But personally, I have loathed commercials my entire life, or at least since I was a kid. Maybe when I was a toddler, I didn't hate them yet. I don't recall that. And so, I go with the golden rule. I don't want to subject you to something I do not want to be subjected to. And so I have refuse to try to monetize anything. I'd rather make a living driving a forklift than sell mushroom pills or Dr. Squatch soap on my videos. Dr. Squatch, I'm sure he's very nice and everything, but I think a dog just, oh, there it is. Gotta be careful. So, I mean, it could be 3 years from now, I'll be selling my own brand of coffee or something, but I sincerely hope not. And I think we should just get right to the answering questions after more than 5 minutes of me yammering away and already starting to sweat from the cozy robe and the fire lit behind me, which is not a real fire, by the way. And Saffron, who survived the neck gash, is now standing right in the way so that you can't see it. It's not really a fire, though. It's one of those fake fires. It's not real wood. It's like porcelain fake wood with natural gas. I prefer real fires, but I don't know. It's just the way it is nowadays, especially in South Carolina, I think, where they don't even sell real Christmas trees. So, I suppose I should commence to answering questions. Leastwise, I'm fixin' to commence. And the first question is from Dharma River. No, it's from Dhamma River. Hope Dhamma River is not offended by me confusing him with perhaps a Mahayana Buddhist. And Dhamma River says, what's your opinion of Hui Neng? And Hui Neng is considered to be the 6th Chinese patriarch of Zen. He's the last patriarch of Zen. The patriarchy, the succession, stopped with Hui Neng. And the Sutra of Hui Neng, also known as the Platform Sutra or the Platform Sutra of Hui Neng, is a sutra, even though it has no pretension of being spoken by the Buddha himself. It's spoken by Hui Neng, supposedly, in China, like medieval China. So in medieval China, there were still sutras, which I assume are part of the Mahayana Tripitaka, that are just centuries separated from early Indian Buddhism and from Gautama Buddha himself. And I've read 2 translations of the Sutra of Hui Neng. And the first one, which was part of a combined volume of the Diamond Sutra and the Sutra of Hui Neng in a Shambhala edition, which was one of my prized possessions as a college student. So I read that first, this Shambhala translation of Hui Neng, the Sutra of Hui Neng. And it seemed like it was really a reliable sutra because supposedly Hui Neng delivered a discourse to a large group of people, including some Chinese dignitaries. And there was supposedly like a scribe, an official Chinese government scribe, who was transcribing the discourse as Hui Neng was delivering it. And so, I mean, that seems pretty reliable. You know, you'd think you're not relying upon a sutra that was transmitted by oral tradition for centuries before it was ever written down. This was written down right then, or so I thought. And then when I was a monk in Burma, I happened to check out from a Buddhist Studies Library, like the International Institute of Advanced Buddhist Studies Library in Rangoon, another translation of the Platform Sutra of Hui Neng. And I think it was translated by a man named Yampolsky. And this was based on a different manuscript. In fact, it was a manuscript which, if I remember correctly, was discovered in a cave like relatively recently in modern times, like some point in the 20th century, and it dates back to the Tang dynasty. And it's an earlier manuscript than the one the Shambhala translation was based on, and it is significantly different. A lot of the narrative part at the beginning and the end is missing. And Yampolsky gives this pretty compelling theory about the whole situation of Hui Neng. That according to Yampolsky, Hui Neng wasn't really the 6th patriarch. At least originally he was not the 6th patriarch. So there's this story that is found in the Sutra of Hui Neng about how Hui Neng became the sixth patriarch. So he's like an illiterate barbarian from like far southern China, where the people there were considered to be rustics and barbarians. He wasn't civilized. He was illiterate. He couldn't read Chinese. But at one point, he becomes enlightened. He has an enlightenment experience. I think, if I remember correctly, he happened to hear a monk chanting the Diamond Cutter Sutra, and that caused this flash of insight, this higher level of consciousness. And so he decides he's going to go and become a Zen monk. And so he goes to the monastery of the fifth patriarch, whose name I don't remember. And because he's just this rustic barbarian village boy type, they don't take him seriously. They don't know that he's enlightened. They just have him like sweeping floors and that kind of thing. He's not even ordained as a monk, really, if I remember correctly. So the fifth patriarch is getting old. He knows he's not going to live forever. And so he decides to have a contest on who can become the sixth patriarch, the next patriarch. And so he says somebody should write a verse on the wall of the refectory, if I remember correctly, to show their level of attainment. And so the only person who dared to write a verse was the senior monk, like the assistant abbot. He was like the senior monk after the patriarch himself. And he wrote a verse that was something like, "The body is a Bodhi stand, the mind a mirror bright. Constantly we wipe it moment by moment, lest any dust alight." So one night or one day, don't remember now, Hui Neng saw this verse that was written on the wall. And the fifth patriarch says, this is a good verse that, everyone should memorize it and study it, even though deep down, according to the sutra, the fifth patriarch knew that this senior monk really was not enlightened. But nobody else dared to compete with him. This is like East Asia, you just don't compete with like someone who's higher than you. So Hui Neng also knew that the verse did not represent an enlightened point of view. So he had somebody write a verse on the wall next to the other verse. He couldn't write it himself because he was illiterate. And the verse went something like, "There is no Bodhi stand, there is no mirror bright. Since everything is void, where can the dust alight?" And so, according to the story, according to the sutra itself, the fifth patriarch knew that this was the enlightened one. This is the one who should become the next patriarch. So he summons Hui Neng into his quarters at night, gives him the robe and bowl of the patriarch to signify the succession, and tells him to flee because these other monks are not going to tolerate some unordained, illiterate barbarian becoming the next patriarch. They're going to assault him, take his bowl and robe away, that kind of thing. So Hui Neng just takes off. And the story continues, but we don't need to continue that saga, because the point is that according to Yampolsky, one reason, probably the main reason why the patriarchy, the lineage was broken with Hui Neng, is that Hui Neng wasn't really the sixth patriarch. That this senior monk who wrote the first verse probably was officially named the sixth patriarch. And his school, which was called the Gradual School of Zen, died out. Hui Neng represented the sudden school, where enlightenment, it's not a gradual process of becoming enlightened. It just hits you like a thunderbolt. Although, like a lot of Zen people will say, sometimes the sudden method takes longer than the gradual method, because it may take a very long time before that sudden thunderbolt hits you. So Yampolsky continues in his very disillusioning introduction to this story, or his theory, that probably the entire platform sutra of Hui Neng is a kind of forgery composed by one of Hui Neng's senior disciples, who I believe was called Sheng Hui. So Sheng Hui just forged this entire platform sutra, putting in the fake details of the meeting and the official scribe transcribing it and everything. And it was mainly just sort of the basics of the teachings of Hui Neng. So, yeah, it was really kind of disillusioning to me that this one sutra, which really seemed at first, just based on the Shambhala edition, that it really was just a transcription of a genuine discourse given by the sixth patriarch. And then Yampolsky comes along with an older manuscript that's significantly different and just shoots down the whole idea of Hui Neng really having been the sixth patriarch. But I guess traditionally he is the sixth patriarch now. He just wasn't originally the sixth patriarch, according to this theory, which does seem plausible and even like persuasive to me. But Hui Neng, the Sutra of Hui Neng has had some significant effect on me. For example, I've said more than once, probably even on Q&A videos in the past, that Hui Neng's idea that when you become enlightened, you look around and see that everybody else is also enlightened. So if you want to liberate all beings, like what Mahayana Buddhists are supposed to do, then the best thing you do is liberate yourself, which is what Theravada Buddhists are supposed to do, because it's only by liberating yourself that you're going to be able to look around and see that everybody else is liberated, that everybody else is already enlightened. If you look through enlightened eyes, you see essentially Nibbana. And if you look through unenlightened eyes, if you're unenlightened, you could look at nirvana, supposedly, all you'd see is samsara, because you're looking through samsara-colored glasses. And see, another thing that stuck with me from the Sutra of Hui Neng is the idea that one of the best practices, like especially when you're meditating, is do not let your thoughts hook up in sequence. If a thought simply arises, fine, note it and let it go, but don't let them hook up into a chain of association, because then you're not meditating anymore. Your mind is just wandering. So this is a very long answer to Dhamma River's question, what is your opinion of Hui Neng? I think he was a wise monk, and I think he may have been enlightened, even though Mahayana Buddhists are supposed to postpone enlightenment until all other beings are enlightened. But according to Hui Neng, the only way to liberate all beings is to become enlightened yourself, and then you look around and see everyone else is enlightened already, which is a little bit paradoxical, I suppose. But when you're dealing with at least two different levels of truth or reality at the same time, paradox is pretty much unavoidable. Whenever you're dealing with infinity, paradox is just always lurking around the corner. So, yeah, it's one of my favorite Mahayana sutras. I haven't read it in years, but it is one of my favorites. And I do think that Hui Neng was a very wise man, possibly an enlightened Buddhist, although I think Yampolsky did kind of persuade me that he wasn't originally the sixth patriarch. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, you always end your Q&As with be happy. Is it possible to induce such a mental state? If so, how? If it is possible, then why don't most people do it? Well, I guess you could sort of induce a happy mental state through like direct stimulation of the pleasure centers of the brain, but you might have to insert an electrode or something first, which would be somewhat inconvenient. Certain intoxicants have a euphoric effect, but I think Romeo really isn't referring to like mechanical, materialistic stimulation of certain areas of the brain. So is it possible to induce a happy mental state? You can't force someone to be happy against their will. If someone is just wallowing in misery, they just vehemently, insistently wallowing in misery, there might not be a whole heck of a lot you can do other than just kind of give them space, just be nice to them. If even that is just backfiring, just kind of steer clear of them until they're feeling better. Just like I've said before, sometimes if someone is unhappy, the best thing you can do is just give them a hug. But To someone who has some flexibility, there are obviously ways of making people happy. Just being sweet to them, being thoughtful and considerate, say something nice, praise them, especially if it's sincere praise. So just love them, just let them know that you love them, you're there for them, that kind of thing. I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt. And as a general rule, it does tend to uplift people and make them happier, if not just flat out blatantly joyful. So if it is possible, then why don't most people do it? Well, most people are also not particularly happy, and it's hard to make someone else happy if you're not happy. I guess maybe like depressed clowns can do it, comedians that are in a bad mood, but they still can manage to do their stand-up monologue thing. I mean, that's possible. But as a general rule, if you're not happy, you're not really eager for other people to be happy either. So there is that. Also, I mean, we're governed by habit. We're unenlightened beings for the most part, governed by habit, and we just haven't developed the habit of trying to uplift the people around us. Some people do. Those are called nice people. There are nice people in this world. But clearly, it's just making other people happy just is not a practical priority for most people in this world. So, I mean, and a lot of people, if they try to make other people happy, it's just like this sort of cookbook method or just, they're forcing it, and that's not going to work either. If you're going to help other people be happy, it helps for you to be happy first. And then your happiness is just contagious because mental states are contagious. So there's that too. Like I've said before, the opposite is also kind of true, where as a general rule, people that are just troublemakers, that are just like messing with other people, they want other people to be unhappy, it's generally because they are suffering. It's a happy person doesn't go around insulting people, making people miserable on purpose. Because if you're happy, it's just like you want your environment to be happy. It's like the happiness inside and the happiness outside have to kind of balance out. It's like water seeking its own level. So, yeah, the dog is wondering why I'm sitting out here talking to this screen. So, let's see here. I think I answered that question. I hope I did, because I'm moving on to the next question. This is from CO of Action Sipad Zidana. And CO of Action Sipad Zidana says, Majjhima Nikaya 38 is the sutta about Sati, the fisherman's son, talking about consciousness going from life to life. Maybe it's Sati. There's no macron over the I in the name. I just interrupted myself. I'll start over. CO of Action Sipad Zidana says, in Majjhima Nikaya 38, it's the sutta about Sati, the fisherman's son, talking about consciousness going from life to life, and is rebuked by the Buddha for claiming this in the same from life, that saying this is the same from life to life. However, Ajahn Thanisaro says that in the Pali, the Buddha specifically says that dependently originated consciousness does not arise without a cause, and even asks Sati what kind of consciousness. Ajahn Thanisaro uses this as further evidence that Nibbana is a kind of consciousness in a way. Can you look at the Pali and confirm this? And do you think what he says is confirmed by this? And your other general thoughts on this. So Ajahn Thanisaro, well, first let's get to the sutta a little bit. The sutta starts with this monk, formerly he was the son of a fisherman. So he might have been a fisherman too, which a lot of the time when they show like a bad or foolish monk in the sutras, they have him descended from some shameful occupation. And this is the case with Sati. He's a fisherman's son. And from a Buddhist point of view, anyone who kills animals for a living, it's not right livelihood. It's not a wise livelihood. So this fisherman's son, Sati, talks about how it's consciousness that passes from one life to the next. And he seems to be referring to one consciousness that is a kind of self or soul. And a lot of kind of new agey kind of people will think that really it's like your consciousness stays the same. That's your soul, your higher self, or whatever. And the Buddha asks him to clarify. And Ajahn Thanissaro apparently is using this as a kind of circumstantial evidence to support his idea that, one kind of consciousness may really pass from one life to the next. But the Buddha is like asking what kind of consciousness he's talking about. And then Sati says it's the kind of consciousness that experiences the results of good and bad actions, that kind of thing. And so then the Buddha declares him to be a fool that has made no attainment at all. And it's very circumstantial argument. It's certainly not any kind of proof at all. That the Buddha is just asking him, what do you mean when you say that? And then Sati says, it's just this consciousness that passes from one life to the next, which is what the experiencer of good and bad actions. And that's kind of similar to what a lot of Thai ajahns are talking about as, the knowing one, the mind that, is it. There is the seeing, and then there is the seer that sees, and that's your consciousness. And they consider that to be a kind of, it's like the Atman in the Upanishads. And Ajahn Thanissaro has been infected by that a little bit, I think. But I think if you wanted to argue that nirvana is a kind of consciousness, you'd be way better off. You'd be on more solid ground, just referring to that one ancient fragment, that verse fragment found in the Majjhima Nikaya and the Digha Nikaya that is apparently referring to nirvana as infinite, formless, unmanifest consciousness. The thing is that in Orthodox Theravada Buddhist philosophy, consciousness is vijnana khandha. It's one of the 5 aggregates, and it arises and passes away 1 trillion times a second, or 17 trillion times a second, trillion times an eye blink, whatever. And it has to arise with conditions. It is a conditioned phenomenon. So then you'll have some people saying, well, that's only vijnana khandha. That's just consciousness as one of the 5 aggregates, when really there's another kind of consciousness that isn't vijnana khandha. And that's what G.C. Pandey, who was a high caste Brahmin who wrote Origins and Studies of Buddhism, that was his preferred interpretation. That may be something along the lines of Ajahn Thanissaro's preferred interpretation also, where you have this higher consciousness that is not conditioned, but it's because it's infinite and formless, it is unmanifest. It's just off the scale. And I really wouldn't argue much against that either. The problem is that early Buddhism does not reify the absolute. Anything you say about the absolute is going to be invalid, so you should just shut up about it. Say as little as possible about it. Because anything you say about it is going to be invalid. To say that it exists is invalid. To say that it doesn't exist is invalid. To say that it does and doesn't exist is invalid. To say that it neither does nor does not exist is invalid. It's off the scale. Words can't touch it. You might as well just shut up on the issue. But some people just can't shut up on the issue. They want to try to sneak it in through the back door, but it's just too big to fit through the back door, so to speak, using metaphorical language. So, let's see, what's the question again? Can you look at the Pali and confirm this? That's Ajahn Thanissaro's evidence. But I mean, it's his evidence mainly consists of asking Sati what exactly he's referring to when he refers to some consciousness that passes from one life to the next. And it may be that all he's doing is just, getting Sati to clarify exactly what he means so that the Buddha can, say what is right or wrong with his theory or his belief. But I mean, the whole is a lot of these suttas where you've got a foolish monk who has wrong view, and Arita, who was formerly a vulture trainer, is another one of these where he has this point of view that is unorthodox, heretical. It's the same consciousness passes from one life to the next. And then these other monks come up to him and say, is it true that you have this pernicious wrong view? And it's like the monk always says, yep, I got that pernicious wrong view. I believe that it's true. It's a pernicious wrong view. It's just so ridiculous. And it could just be that the original story just got turned into this stock formula where the foolish monk even kind of admits that he has a pernicious wrong view, but just stubbornly insists on following it and believing it anyway. Or it could just be that it's just kind of made up, the whole story. Hard to say. But yeah, Ajahn Nisro, I mean, it's just circumstantial evidence, and rather flimsy circumstantial evidence. So, at least as far as I understand the question and what Ajahn Nisro says. So, I guess I'll just move on to Siyovaksha Sipad Zirna's next question, which is as follows. Well, I'm going to take a sip of my beverage first. It's orange juice. Citrus is good in the wintertime. Or so I've been told. Okay then. Siyovaksha Sipad Zirna says, make sure that we're really recording. Yeah, we're really recording. Siyovaksha Sipad Zirna says, in real life, I have a tendency of constant thinking and rationalizing that prevents me from acting at all in the world and being frozen. I am not able to initiate anything by myself in regards of choosing what to eat, who to talk to when meeting new people, what to do in my free time, or make any real decisions. It feels like there is something people naturally have that I might be missing or never developing it due to being raised in a very sheltered way where my parents told me what to do and I didn't disobey and just did what they told me. Now I have no ability to make independent decisions of my own because I don't know what my values are or if I even have any other way to initiate decision making, thus just continue what I did as a kid, and that is just spend my time browsing the internet. What should I do in a situation like this? Well, Siyovaksha Sipad Zirna has asked this question in other words on a previous Q&A. And one thing I'd point out is that he says he can't do anything here. I'm not able to initiate anything by myself, he says. But I mean, obviously you initiated sending this question on the Q&A. Your parents didn't tell you to send this question to the Q&A. So overanalysis paralysis does exist in this world. I've known a few people with overanalysis paralysis. I've had it myself. But I mean, here it says, let's see. I'm not able to initiate anything by myself in regards to choosing what to eat. I would assume that if you get hungry enough, you're just gonna have to decide. You know, it's like you're not just gonna sit there and starve because your parents aren't there to tell you what to eat. So I think a lot of this is sort of passive indecisiveness that, I mean, you're just going to have to plow through it. I mean, sometimes, I mean, I think the last time I answered this question, I was saying that, I mean, sometimes I can sort of get indecisive. Sometimes it's obviously ridiculous. Like sometimes as a monk, I'd have this, like a whole bunch of these water bottles. You know, they're these bottles of water that people would donate to me. And most of it's like the exact same brand. They're essentially identical. And I'd go in there and catch myself thinking, which one should I take? And it's like, it doesn't matter. They're all the same. And then I just grab one. So, I mean, sometimes you just got to catch yourself and realize, just kind of rationalize to yourself, talk some sense to yourself that you actually have to get something done. And so you should do it, even if you're not 100% certain that it's the right thing to do. It's let's do this, even if we do it wrong. And I've gotten to that point many, many times. It's just when you start thinking too much and hesitating, it gets to the point where you actually have to do something. And so you just pick what seems like the best thing to do and do it. And Siyovaksha Sipad Zirna, he talks about being unattractive to women because of his looks. But I guarantee you that for a normal woman, which, I mean, young women nowadays, I don't have much exposure to them. You know, it's like they're all completely, you know, sold on, what is it, Instagram and TikTok and all this maybe. But I mean, those aren't the women that you want to attract anyhow. Like the superficial, mainstream, normie chicks that are just essentially what used to be called shameless sluts. I mean, those aren't the kind of women you want anyway. So just going with normal women, which may be in the minority now, like not normal in the sense of statistically normal, because those would be like the Instagram thoughts. I mean, just sort of still relatively healthy in their attitude. The dogs are running around on a hardwood floor. That's why they make that noise. How you doing? So, I mean, going with normal women, I think being passive and indecisive is going to be much more unattractive to a woman than just physical appearance, assuming that one isn't just hideous. I mean, a person could be just average looking, maybe even a little bit homely looking, but if they're aggressive and decisive, a lot of women will find that attractive because women themselves, this is sexual dimorphism in the human race. I'm sorry, it might not be politically correct, but it is objectively true. Women tend to be more passive than men do, partly because they don't have as high of testosterone levels. So maybe you should take testosterone treatments or something, which will make you more impulsive, more aggressive, more decisive. Although I really do not recommend like chemical therapies as a way of changing one's attitude. I mean, some kind of herbal stuff maybe. They sell a lot of testosterone boosters that are just like, what is it? It's some kind of Indian Ashwagandha. No, not Ashwagandha. That was a monk. Ashwagandha. Which I guess is also a kind of aquarium plant. So, I mean, you just have to get to the point, you have to be able to recognize when you're undergoing overanalysis paralysis, and you have to realize that you have to make a decision, and so you just make the best decision you can at the moment with no regrets. It may be you're 10% of the way down the road, you realize there's a better way of doing it. If it's not too late, then you can switch to the better way of doing it. But just sitting there and not knowing what to do and being passive and just hoping things get better isn't going to work. Hope is not a strategy. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question. But I mean, obviously, Siovak and Sipadzina does have the ability to make independent decisions on his own because, for example, he asked this question without anybody telling him to ask the question. He asks quite a few questions, in fact. He's one of the main questioners on these Q&As. So it's just a matter of catching yourself, being mindful enough to know when you're in that situation. And when you have to make a decision, like you're hungry, you got to eat something, your mama's not there telling you what to eat, then you're just going to have to decide what to eat. And it might not be the best thing to eat, so what? Just eat it. So anyways, I hope I answered that question kind of. I hope there was at least some tiny morsel of useful advice in there. Because I'm moving on to Siovak and Sipadzina's third question, which is, most conservative people in the world seem quite content with the mainstream cultural version of the religion, but the spiritual parts always seem like a gathering place for the mentally ill, especially in the West. Does this pattern hold in non-Western cultures as well from your experience, and why do you think this is the case? Well, yeah, it holds true in Burma also to some degree. Like some of the strictest monks are very eccentric. You know, some of the most serious, like meditative, strict in Vinaya kind of monks tend to be a bit on the eccentric side. And one of the reasons for that is that in order to be successful in the spiritual life, there has to be a little bit of just like wild-eyed fanaticism. That just being detached and philosophical results, for the most part, in being lukewarm. And being lukewarm just isn't good enough. You got to have this virya, this drive, and a certain amount of fanaticism, which is often which often goes hand in hand with a certain amount of nuttiness. I mean, read about Catholic saints, like European medieval Catholic saints. A lot of them were really nutty people. They might have still had very high attainments. They might have been masters of jhana, or contemplation, as the Catholics call it, high contemplation, but still they were nutty and advanced at the same time. Saint Teresa of Avila, for example. I've talked about her before. I've read her autobiography. Saint John of the Cross, who I think may have been like an enlightened Christian, if there ever has been one. He talked about the stage of perfection, and he considered Saint Teresa of Avila to have reached the stage of perfection. And Saint Teresa of Avila, like I've mentioned before, she was seeing so many visions of like angels and like devils and beings in hell, and maybe the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary made a lot of appearances in people's visions back in those days. She was seeing so many of them that her father confessor was getting concerned that maybe the Inquisition was going to get involved because she might be possessed by something. And so he told her, whenever she sees any vision like this, just to make the sign of the cross. And she was doing it so often. Her arms were getting tired from making the sign of the cross. So she just brought a crucifix around with her and just holding up the crucifix every time she'd see one of these visions. And at the same time, I mean, she was a very intelligent, effective person. You know, she was the founder of the new Discalced Carmelite order, and really was an intelligent and just a very skillful administrator, good at like persuading people, you know, like in politics and so forth, getting papal nuncios to go along with what she wanted to do and all this kind of stuff. Another one is George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, who was a personal secretary to Oliver Cromwell. He was relatively wealthy, just successful, competent administrator. And at the same time, he's hearing voices and acting in really strange, nutty ways. So there is a certain, I think part of it is to be very spiritually like talented, you have to be liminal. You have to be kind of getting out onto the fringe anyway. So, I mean, someone who is talented spiritually is going to be at the edge of the bell-shaped curve. They're going to be in just this kind of liminal state where weird things happen. And I mean, genius and insanity are like very close together, and spiritual genius and insanity also are kind of close together. Anyone who's read the biography of Ajahn Mun, I mean, I've been warned I shouldn't say Ajahn Mun was maybe a bit on the nutty side because he's considered to be an arahant in Thailand. But you read this, he was like one of those medieval Catholic saints. So there's a bunch of factors involved, like the fanaticism aspect, that you pretty much need fanaticism to really drive you full blast in your spiritual practice, that lukewarm mediocrity isn't good enough. And also, my sweetie's distracted me. She's walking around over there. What was I saying? Oh, also, I mean, just the very fact that if you're spiritually advanced or on the road to spiritual advancement, then you're going to be on the edge. You're going to be on the fringe anyway. That normies tend to be just the standard brand of semi-conscious delusion. So, my sweetie's going to go to the store. So she's walking around alluringly and distracting me. I always make her leave the room when I do one of these because I've got like this radar. I always like sense her presence, and when she gets too close, I start getting distracted. So anyways, yeah, I think I answered that. There's probably other things that I could have mentioned, but even I calculated when I was drying myself off after taking a shower today, even though I don't use soap, I was thinking just like 5 minutes per question. If I get 40 questions, I mean, that's 3 hours right there. If I did my math right. Let's see, 3 hours is 180 minutes. So 40 questions, yeah, that'd be a little more than 4 minutes per question, 4.5 minutes per question. And it stretches out to 3 hours. not even including the what do you call it? Digressions, this is right here is a digression. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid says, how would a Buddhist properly rebuke someone? Well, in Vinaya, the rules of monastic discipline, it says that a monk should not rebuke or admonish. Admonish is probably a better word. Rebuke is too negative. There's like this hint of anger involved in rebuke. So maybe admonish would be a better word. And according to the rules of monastic discipline, if a monk should not admonish another monk unless he has metta in his heart. If you're just pissed off and venting, it's not going to work. You're just going to be breaking a rule by doing that. So the best way to admonish someone, if not rebuke someone, is, you got to be on their side and trying to help them and not just venting irritation at what they do. So anything you do with metta in your heart is bound to have a lot of positivity to it and is more likely to have positive effects. So I think I'm just going to move on to Zenithoid's second question, which is along the same vein. Can you give an example of a rebuke done well, either from your own life or the Buddhist texts? Well, in the text, the Buddha sometimes is pretty harsh, like Sati, who was the son of a fisherman. He just flat out called him a fool who had no wisdom at all. And until finally Sati was sitting there all slumped over and just like completely crestfallen. He was shamed and humiliated because he got chewed out by the Buddha himself. But if you're an authority figure and someone is like your charge, it's your duty to discipline this person, then a certain amount of harshness may be called for. Like if you're a parent, you've got to discipline a child. Sometimes it may be that a spank on the behind is the way to go. So it depends on the circumstance, but if someone is your equal or like higher than you, then yeah, you're probably better off not angrily rebuking them, let alone the swat on the behind. So let's see, can you give an example of a rebuke done well? Rebuke is just admonishment probably would be a better word here, I think. Because rebuke, as I said, it's got this connotation at least of like anger and scolding and so forth, which, you're already on the wrong track when you get angry and scolding, unless you can scold with love in your heart. So, I don't know, it's like if someone is messing up, you can calmly point out to them that they're messing up. Explain to them what they're doing wrong with like a brotherly tone of voice. And if they don't give a shit, they already know they're doing it wrong and they don't care, then, there's no point in wasting your breath on them. You might, go to someone else if it really is a problem, go to their supervisor or something. But a specific example, I generally don't admonish people much anymore. And at the time when I have admonished people, like when I was a senior monk in Burma, you can't really be sure whether you did it well or not because you don't know exactly what effect it had on the other person. With regard to rebukes in the texts, it's usually the Buddha rebuking people, and like with regard to Sati, the son of a fisherman, that he was pretty harsh with him. So, yeah, I think an admonishment done well is really, you have to have a certain amount of metta in your heart, and you have to have like benevolent motives. You have to be trying to help the other person by admonishing them, to point out to them that what they're doing isn't right, and that they should probably do it some other way, that kind of thing. That would be done well. To do it with metta and you get the point across, then you've done it well. So, sorry if I couldn't come up with a specific example other than the Buddha chewing out Sati. I'm just going to move on to Zenithoid's third question, which is, should Buddhist laity who are knowledgeable in Dhamma rebuke monks, especially sloppy ones, or is it not their place to do so? I was listening to a talk by the Orthodox Christian priest, Father Josiah Trenum, where he mentions that if a priest starts preaching heresy, it is the duty of anyone listening, including the laity, to rebuke them. What counts as heretical belief in Buddhism is not as strict as it is in Christianity, but I think Buddhists should be applying this standard to monks who do not live dharmic lives or practice vinaya. Well, for starters, the obvious thing, like in Burma, like in a Buddhist country, if there's a sloppy monk, the first avenue of action is just don't support them. If it's something that you consider to be serious, I mean, it's just monks handling money, that sort of thing, which most monks do, then they know that they're not supposed to handle money. They don't, they just don't care. And I mean, a lot of Asian people may think that you're just going to go to hell for rebuking a monk. And again, rebuke is just not a good word. Like admonish, or just tell the monk that you don't feel comfortable with them doing what they're doing. That, like if a monk's handling money, then I don't know. Like I said, I mean, it's kind of pointless to even bring that up to a monk, because almost all monks know that by handling money, they're breaking the rules and they don't care. So you can wake up someone who's sleeping, but someone who's just pretending to be asleep, it's trickier to wake them up, especially if they are just insistent on just continuing to pretend that they're asleep. With regard to a Buddhist teaching wrong view, a Buddhist teacher, or like even a monk who's teaching wrong view, then it depends on the circumstances. I mean, if he's given a group talk and he's saying, women should have reproductive freedom or whatever, implying that women should be able to get abortions, when according to Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, abortion is murder. That conception, that life, the life of a human being begins at conception. That's when rebirth linking consciousness begins. That's when the karmic stream of the new life begins, is at conception. So you got some leftist monk, or pandering to leftists in the West, advocating for female reproductive rights or whatever, then yeah, I mean, you could politely point out that, abortion is technically murder, that any monk who helps a woman get an abortion is excommunicated instantaneously for the rest of his life, regardless of the opinions of Western liberals. So, I mean, if they're going to say something that is just flat out wrong view, saying something wrong that might even be harmful, then it's a judgment call. I mean, I've sat through discourses given by a Western monk. He was called Ajahn, but I mean, he really didn't know very much. And he would just say this stuff that, like the first verse of the Dhammapada says, the mind is like the ocean. And the first verse of the Dhammapada says nothing about any ocean. It's just, I don't know where he came up with this stuff. And I would just sit through it. And the audience is just eating it up with a spoon. They loved this guy. And I'd be sitting there like trying not to make faces, trying to keep both eyebrows at the same level, instead of just kind of like this, kind of leaning away from him. Because I'd be sitting up front next to him, because I was a monk at the time too. Sometimes, I mean, it's just not worth the effort. I mean, it just seems like a lost cause. I couldn't just interrupt him in the middle of his discourse, his sermon, and correct him. They'd probably find fault with me, because the audience didn't know any different. They would just think I was being a troublemaker or something. Well, I mean, it might be that just in front of other people, if something is just really egregious, you might call them out on it. Otherwise, you might wait until later and take him aside so that you can have a private discussion, that kind of thing. So, let's see. What is the question here? maybe I should refresh my memory with regard to what the actual question is. Should Buddhist laity who are knowledgeable in Dhamma rebuke monks, especially sloppy ones, or is it not their place to do so? Rebuke, again, like admonish would be a better, kinder kind of word. And your first option is just don't support what you consider to be bad monks or just really sloppy monks. And if you think that what they're doing or teaching is just really harmful, really egregious, then you can call them out on that. But you should do so carefully. Try not to do it with any vituperation. Try to do it, for the benefit of people rather than just like venting like aversion for what he was saying or for him personally, that kind of thing. So, if you go about it wisely with metta in your heart, with good intentions, sometimes you can get away with that sort of thing. But you should choose your battles wisely, I guess. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Samana Recluse. And Samana Recluse says, I've started thinking that Sassana existed only for 500 years probably, but there was no number of years mentioned in any early suttas. Maybe they corrupted bhikkhus, erased it, if there really were numbers anywhere. After living among bhikkhus in Burma and Thailand, I've lost faith in Theravada bhikkhus. I already know how Mahayana monks are. They are even worse, mostly. So I guess becoming bhikkhu to get enlightened would be a naive thing to do these days. To learn Dhamma, internet is being enough nowadays. For those who lives in solitude and learning Dhamma with wisdom will get enlightened, in my opinion. What do you think of Sassana and original Buddhist teachings? And please tell me the name of your monastery with cave that you dwelt for 10 years. I want to stay there for some time. Please spell it. Okay, well, that's like 2 questions, so I got to separate these. Okay, so the first one, or is there even a question here? Oh, what do I think of the Sassana and the original Buddhist teachings? Well, that could be an hour-long video all in and of itself. I'll just address some of the stuff he said up here. He started thinking that the Sassana existed for only 500 years. There was no number of years mentioned in any early suttas. Well, in the Vinaya, I think it might be at the beginning of the Bhikkhuni Kanda, which I would guess is, I can't remember whether it's the Mahavaga or the Chulavaga of the Vinaya Pitaka, but it's the story of the Buddha starting up the order of bhikkhunis or Buddhist nuns. And it was the Buddha's aunt, his stepmother also, the same woman, Mahabhajapati Gautami. Is that right? Yeah, Mahabhajapati Gautami, who she was following the Buddha around, begging him to ordain her as the first nun, and he just kept refusing. So, he was just saying, just no, it's not going to happen. Don't even bring it up. Then Ananda, his cousin, I think, and also his attendant, his chief attendant, Ananda, who was also of the Gautama clan. He talked the Buddha into it, mainly using the argument that aren't women just as capable of becoming enlightened as men are? The Buddha had to admit, yes, women can become enlightened also, just like men can. And so then Ananda was saying, well, then why shouldn't women be able to get ordained and live the holy life too? So finally, the Buddha relented, and it was like, well, now you've done it. All right, there's going to be nuns now, but because of this, the Sassana will only exist for 500 years. So the true Dhamma will exist for only 500 years. And the commentary, which was composed more than 500 years later, they had to come up with a completely lame excuse. They couldn't say that the Buddha was wrong. They couldn't say that the Buddha didn't really say it. So they said, well, when he said 500 years, what he meant was 5,000 years. So that's like Orthodox tradition now, is that Buddhism will exist for 5,000 years, even though it says quite clearly in the texts that the true Dhamma will exist for only 500 years. And personally, I'm kind of skeptical that the Buddha really said it, because I'm a Westerner, I can question the authenticity of texts in a way that like a devout Burmese Buddhist just couldn't. So it does say that Buddhism will exist for only 500 years. The true Dhamma will exist for only 500 years in the text. And that was 2,500 years ago. So if that is literally true, then the true Dhamma no longer exists, at least not in an unbroken lineage. So after that, he says, after living among bhikkhus in Burma and Thailand, I've lost faith in Theravada bhikkhus. Well, there are some strict ones. I mean, it may be 2% of the Sangha is really devout and conscientious, strict in their practice. You know, they really are striving for enlightenment. It may be less than 2%, but they do exist out there, and there are good monasteries. You may have to search for them. They might be out in some remote forest area somewhere. But you can still find like conscientious, seriously practicing monks in Burma, in Thailand, and also in Sri Lanka, although in Sri Lanka it might be well below 1%. So, yeah, I can relate. I remember looking for a good place, like a good forest area in northwestern Burma. My first time, I'd only been a monk for a few years at that time. And it was just depressing. Every monastery I went to, it's like the monks weren't even trying. You know, they weren't even trying to follow the simple rules, much less anything more advanced. You know, it's just, I remember this one place in northwestern Burma. I went to this monastery. I was going to spend the night. I was traveling. And I get to the main Dharma hall, and there's this sloppy, criminal-looking monk sitting on a stool at the entrance to the Dharma hall. He's chewing betel, so his mouth is all red. And he's got a handful of money in one hand. And lay people, the villagers, were having to pay admission to go in and watch the TV set that they had in the Dharma hall. So it's sort of like a kind of like a movie theater, a village movie theater or something, with the ticket taker being this monk chewing betel. And he just kind of stared at me with just like this kind of a dead look. I was asking where the Seattle was. So let's see. Yeah, so I mean, there are some entire areas where it's just out of fashion for monks to practice strictly, but there are still some places where you can go, where you can find conscientious, strictly practicing monks. So then he says, so I guess becoming a bhikkhu to get enlightened would be a naive thing to do these days? Not really. I mean, you don't really need other monks. Once you get your training, you can just go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. Like the sutta says, you can live alone in a cave and so forth. And it's easier to get your basic needs satisfied, like food, if you're a monk, than if you're just Joe Schmo, living in a cave. So to learn Dhamma internet is being enough nowadays. Well, that's not exactly true either. I mean, if you're really talented, it might be enough that you just need a certain amount of advice. But to have somebody overseeing you, giving you feedback, especially towards the beginning, is definitely helpful to have an actual teacher. So let's see here. For those who lives in solitude and learning Dhamma with wisdom will get enlightened. Not everybody's ready for enlightenment. It is unfortunate that most people, the overwhelming majority of the human race, just is not ripe. They're not ripe for enlightenment yet. So what do I think of the Sassana and the original Buddhist teachings? Well, I mean, it's certainly anicca. Buddhism is impermanent and has, certainly it has declined from the Buddhist time. But there still is a lot of genuine wisdom and Dhamma there. And the original Buddhist teachings, I mean, the highest concentration of it is in the suttas, with some suttas being more likely to be authentic than others. I mean, I've discussed that sort of thing elsewhere. So, I mean, I do have a relatively short playlist of studies in early Buddhism or studies in archaic Buddhism that might give some hint as to what the earliest Buddhism was like. The original Buddhist teachings, but it's just too vast of a subject for me to try and to try and do it justice in this Q&A, because I got about 40 other questions to attend to. So I'll just move on. Oh yeah, the second part of his question, please tell me the name of your monastery with the cave that you dwelt for 10 years. I want to stay there for some time. Please spell it. It's One Bow. In English, it would be One Bow Wildlife Refuge Monastery. And One Bow would be WUN space BO. One Bow. In Burmese, it would be One Bow Bemet Dojaun. And it's on the bank of the Chindwin River. It's like something like 15 miles upriver from the city of Monua. So if you go to Monua in northwestern Burma, go to the boat dock, try to rent like a sampan or something. Going by boat is by far the most scenic and comfortable way of getting there. If you go by a car, it's not as comfortable, but you can do that too. There are roads there now. So it'd be in between the villages of Wunbo, WUN space BO, and Lamye, which would be LAY space MYAY. And it's in Budalin Township. The nearest sizable town is Budalin, which would be BUTALIN. And it's all in Sagaing Division in northwestern Burma. So, yeah, just Wunbo Bemet Dojaun, Wunbo Fort Monastery. And once you get to Monua and you get to the boat dock where there's people that can rent boats, then they'll know what you're talking about, and we'll be able to get you there. Or, I mean, if you can rent a car or something, with a driver, and then they'll probably be able to. It's a relatively well-known place. I've lived in a number of other caves in Burma. That was the one where I spent more than 10 years. Of all the places I've ever lived in my life, I think that one cave at that one monastery is the one place I've lived longer than anywhere else. So let's see here. I think I answered that one, so I'm going to move on to the next one. This is from Skuladin or Skuladin, who's one of the only people who ask questions on BitChute. And he says, it's long been held a tradition to tell ghost stories on Christmas Eve. Would you kindly tell you a ghost story? Well, I mean, I do have a few, I suppose. I mean, the ones where I've seen ghosts, I've talked about that a number of times already. My little brother, he would keep seeing the man when we were kids. He was 4 years younger than me. He still is, pretty sure. And he would keep seeing the man. He was like 5 years old, maybe 3 to 5 years old. And if he'd see the man during the daytime, someone was about ready to sit down in a chair and he says, don't sit down on that chair. The man is sitting there. But he was okay with seeing him during the day. But at night, it would freak him out. He was scared. He'd have to have a night light on at night and so forth. And so my father, who conducted seances and ran a little coven of witches and so forth, he attended a seance once. And Uncle Henry came through. And Uncle Henry was formerly a slave of one of my great-grandfathers. And after emancipation, after the Civil War, Uncle Henry just stayed with the family. And he was, he was sort of like the butler, and he was just a member of the family. And he was the only person who could call my great-grandfather Baptist and get away with it. That his name was John Roach. I think my great-grandfather's name was John Roach, and his nickname was John the Baptist Roach. And Uncle Henry is the only person who could call him Baptist to his face, and he would scold him. They were sort of like roommates. Anyways, Uncle Henry came through in this seance. And my father asked him if he was, visiting our home, because my father was a very liminal person. We had poltergeist phenomena, just weird stuff happening in our house. And my father asked Uncle Henry if he was visiting the house. And he said yes. And so my father asked him, could you please not do it? You're scaring the hell out of my youngest boy. So Uncle Henry says, all right. And then my brother never saw his man again. So that's kind of a ghost story. I mean, it's not as spectacular. I watched a ghost show last night. I mentioned, I think it was the previous Q&A, my sweetheart, my woman, has gotten me into this tradition of before going to sleep, you watch a ghost show, and usually we fall asleep before the ghost show is over. And then it just auto plays to the next one. And while we're asleep. So anyways, there was this, it was a good ghost show. It was about Butte, Montana. There was this haunted mansion in Butte, Montana, and eventually it got bought out. It got turned into a frat house for some university. I'm not sure what university is in Butte, Montana. I think the University of Montana is in Helena. But anyways, there's especially this one room, room 7, in this frat house. And nobody wanted to live there. It just gave people the willies just to walk into that room. And back in the 1970s, there was a guy named Herb something who stayed in that room, and he just kind of went over the deep end and just started trying to kill people. And so you've got this research team, these paranormal investigators. You've got this big bald guy, Dave Schrader or something, who used to be on a different ghost show called The Holzer Files. And then he's got the psychic, the show's psychic is this woman named Cindy Kaza. And, you know, she's the sensitive, she's the paranormal sensitive. And then the guy, he goes more with the technological stuff. And so they're investigating this house. Cindy Kaza, the psychic, walks into room 7 and she just starts like freaking out. She has to leave. You know, it's rare that you see her panic, but she couldn't really open up her psychic abilities. She couldn't do automatic writing or that kind of thing to get more of a feel as to what's going on, because just deep down she just felt threatened that there was something dangerous there, and she just could not allow herself to open up and use her higher psychic talents and so forth. And the guy, Schrader, I think his name was, he has some kind of special recorder, like a lot of them have, that there's kind of staticky in the background. And then you can sometimes kind of hear voices in the static where entities supposedly are manipulating the static to communicate. And it just came through really clearly, you know, I got her or Herb, and I'm going to get you too. And I mean, the guy it was a weird show. I mean, to some degree, they have to sensationalize it, kind of make a good show. But he was just literally he was so shaken by the end of the show, because it wasn't just a ghost. There was some kind of demonic entity that was like haunting this house, and it was like enslaving spirits, including this Herb guy, I think, who had gone insane and tried to kill people back in the 70s when he was a student living in the frat house. You know, he was just like crying, just weeping openly. And that's the first time I'd ever seen him do that. I mean, I've seen quite a few shows with the same guy on it. And I mean, he was just shaken. Cindy Kaza, the psychic, had to flee the house twice on two different occasions. That really she was afraid that they were just making things worse. Things were just getting worse instead of better. But so it was like you had this kind of demonic entity that could possess people. And it was sort of, for some reason, like enslaving other spirits in this house that, I mean, a skeptic can just say it's all bullshit, but I've seen enough weird stuff in my life to at least be open-minded with regard to the reality of at least some of it. Also, there was some kid there, the spirit of some kid who was leaving handprints on things, including one of the paranormal investigators. He was sort of the sidekick of the big bald guy. He had this handprint just suddenly appear on his back. A little hand, like a kid-sized hand. It was just weird stuff. So I guess that's the best you're going to get for ghost stories from me, at least this time. So I'm moving on to Skeladden's next question. This is kind of an easy one. If the ghost of Don Cornelius from Soul Train were to show up right in front of you And he said he needed you to dance to aid in his eternal mission of spreading peace, love, and soul. What kind of moves would you bust to bring goodwill to all and joy to everyone? Well, I mean, it doesn't say that I actually have to do it. It just Don Cornelius from Soul Train, he says that he needs me to dance. And I just might say, well, you picked the wrong guy. I'm just not a dancing fool like some people are. But if I absolutely had to dance, I mean, Don Cornelius pulled a gun on me and told me to dance. I might do the Jed Clampett dance, which you're never going to see me do on a video. But the Jed Clampett dance is if I just bust out dancing, there's a good chance it's going to be the Jed Clampett dance. And anyone who's seen a lot of Beverly Hillbillies reruns, like the old black and white ones, the Beverly Hillbillies kind of started sucking after it went to color. But you might actually see Jed Clampett cutting a rug, doing the Jed Clampett dance. So I'm just going to move on to Skeladden's next question, his third question, which he says is an unrelated question, which is kind of good. He says, you mentioned you came across a fellow who seems to be burning off the karma of a Richie Cunningham, and that he took a heroic amount of psychedelics like Neem Karoli Baba. What's the most profound thing he said to you? Maybe it's soup related, like Ram Dass said. No, this guy I knew in Bellingham, Washington, really nice guy, super clean cut. You know, he really kind of has this Richie Cunningham vibe. And he went to an ayahuasca ceremony, and the ayahuasca had no effect on him whatsoever. And so I was just kind of teasing him, saying, it's your white bread karma. You know, he's so clean cut, so normal, that it's like he had no liminal openings for the medicine to really take effect. And so he went to another ayahuasca ceremony where they gave him like increased doses. In fact, they were giving him like this ball of solid ayahuasca to eat, and it just had no effect whatsoever, just nothing. And it wasn't because he was so spiritually advanced. I think it was just that he was such a Richie Cunningham kind of normie with just such absolute white bread karma that it just couldn't take effect. And I think he eventually started trying mushrooms, and he said it was interesting, but he really didn't get a lot out of that either. So I mean, I can't remember anything really profound that he said. You know, he was a good guy, really good guy. And, you know, he practiced meditation. He went to the local Dharma hall. That's how I met him. And I think possibly the most impressive thing that he ever told me is this clean-cut guy from Texas. You wouldn't expect it at all. He had actually gone on a kind of pilgrimage to India and visited Ramana Maharshi's ashram. So, yeah, maybe that's the most profound thing he ever told me, even though, you know, it was just more of an impressive thing than a profound one. But aside from that, I really don't recall us having any really profound philosophical discussions or any such thing. And it wasn't like he was Neem Karoli Baba where the ayahuasca had no effect on him just because, you know, he was just centered at this plane far beyond the effects of ayahuasca. Like Neem Karoli Baba supposedly took 1,200 micrograms of very pure pharmaceutical LSD, took them very slowly and obviously right in front of somebody, and it had no obvious effect on him whatsoever. But that was a different deal than this guy that I met in Bellingham, Washington, who just, he was not like an enlightened sage as far as I can tell. You know, he just seemed like a really nice, clean-cut kind of guy, like Richie Cunningham again. And it's just, for some reason, ayahuasca had no effect on him. One of the strange few, I think, because I've taken ayahuasca a few times. It just turns me inside out. So, yeah, maybe it was something about soup. I don't know. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Tig. And Tig, who's kind of a irreverent, smart alecky kind of guy, says, do you like pumpkin ales? Will you have any for Christmas? And I've never had a pumpkin ale in my life. I tend to avoid anything like pumpkin spice. That's kind of a girly thing. I don't do pumpkin spice. Pumpkin flavored stuff. I mean, pumpkin pie I might have once every few years. Just somebody gives me pumpkin pie, I won't refuse it, I guess. But pumpkin ales, no, I've never had a pumpkin ale. I can't recall. I guess I've seen them at stores or something, but just not interested. And I will not have any for Christmas. I'm not going to have eggnog for Christmas either. I'm just one of those kind of people. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And I might as well, because I've got kind of a dry mouth, open the emergency backup beverage. And this question is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam. For those of you who are listening, I just took a prolonged swig of the emergency backup beverage. Anyways, Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam, says, Daniel Ingram believes that insight territory can be used to distinguish the dark night of the soul associated with the arising and passing stage of insight from clinical psychosis. Do you estimate that good results will come from this, despite the prevailing delusion in his work that fourth path attainment, or full enlightenment, is reached almost exclusively through meditative insight? Now, when Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam, says Daniel Ingram believes that insight territory can be used to distinguish, I didn't know what insight territory was, so I asked him to clarify, and he said insight territory is jhana progression, or what they perceive that to be. So, that's kind of different. What Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam, calls insight territory appears to be just the standard progression of meditation through jhana. So, Daniel Ingram believes that jhana can be used to distinguish the dark night of the soul associated with the arising and passing stage of insight from clinical psychosis. I'm kind of skeptical of that, because if you're clinically psychotic, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. And if you're not clinically psychotic, then you may be able to tell the difference. So for some people that really are clinically psychotic, I don't think they're going to be able to tell the difference between the psychosis they've got and the dark night of the soul. And I suppose I should clarify what the dark night of the soul is. And I don't recall vividly. It's been a long time since I read the collected works of St. John of the Cross. But the dark night of the soul, according to St. John of the Cross, who I think coined the term, is there are times when you just stop making progress, and it's like all of your consolations, the feeling of the nearness of God, just the euphoria of deep contemplation, the joy in meditating, all of that is gone. You're just in a state of aridity of soul, aridity of spirit. And it feels like you've lost everything. And St. John of the Cross considers you to be really blessed at a time like that, because that's when the big advancements can happen. That's when the big changes can happen. It's sort of like you have to undergo this sort of a crisis in order to break through to the next stage, which is a higher and better stage. So Daniel Ingram believes that jhana progression can be used to distinguish the dark night of the soul associated with the arising and passing stage of insight from clinical psychosis. Well, I think the clinical psychosis might be some severe depression. And so I think what he's talking about here, Stellar Supreme has a cerebral way of expressing himself that sometimes is difficult to follow. But my sweetie's back now too, so that's a little bit distracted now. So anyways, let's see here. So I think the question here is, you've got this spiritual depression going through the dark night, as opposed to just clinical psychotic depression that is just like immobilizing, incapacitating. And I think you should be able to tell the difference. It's hard to say. I mean, I've never really just been that depressed, like in the St. John of the Cross sense of the dark night of the soul. I've had times of spiritual aridity where you just have to kind of muscle through it, that kind of a thing. But just being absolutely bereft of any consolation whatsoever, I went through that once. And it did precede one of the main spiritual growth spurts I ever had. But I mean, I knew myself well enough to know that I wasn't being psychotic. And I think anyone who does a lot of meditation, whether they've mastered jhana or not, should be able to know whether they are psychotic or not. Or rather, what they should know that they're not psychotic. Because if you are psychotic, you're not going to know it, probably. So, I mean, you just have to have faith in yourself. And that's generally the way I went through it. Just living alone in caves and meditating and, going through crises and sometimes a few depressions and so forth. Yeah, I mean, the thought that maybe I'm psychotic really never really, it wasn't a viable option for me to entertain, other than just the idea that anyone who isn't fully enlightened is insane from a Buddhist point of view. And I am sorry that you may not be able to appreciate the deep purple tone of this cozy robe that my lovely mate insisted that I wear for this video. So, gosh, I mean, this is Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. He's really good at these kind of unintentionally abstruse, cerebral, subtle kinds of questions that there are things that a lot of the time I've never really considered before. Like, how do you know whether you're going through the dark night of the soul or whether you just got like this severe manic depression, this bipolar episode or something? I mean, there's not necessarily a difference necessarily, because I mean, you're just looking at it from two different points of view. You're looking at it from the clinical point of view of Western psychology, which is going to consider a lot of saints, highly advanced saints, to just be maladjusted and fucked up. I mean, they wouldn't use those words. But like the very first chapter, or one of the first chapters of William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience, what I would encourage anyone who wants to understand religious experience better to read. He points out that a lot of these people, he uses George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, who I mentioned earlier, as an example of, by modern psychological standards, spiritually advanced people may seem to be insane, or at least maladjusted, dysfunctional. And so there's really not even necessarily a distinction to be made between the dark night of the soul, which is looked at in spiritual terms through the eyes of a mystic, and like clinical depression, which is looked at from a clinical point of view by some psychologists with a PhD from some university. They might be considered the same in some cases. But it's not really something that I had any trouble with, because I never really considered myself to be psychotic, except in the philosophical sense of, anyone who isn't fully enlightened is insane. So I'm sorry if I couldn't answer that one any better than I did, because I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Quasator. And Quasator says, does an Arya's equanimity karma, he says karma, does an Arya's equanimity karma, or karma that ends karma, protect them from harm whilst on the eightfold path to arahantship? Thanks for your response regarding arahants being in fourth jhana. Okay, so that's not part of the question. I didn't have to write that down. See, I was thinking that the only thing preventing jhanas were okay, so I don't have to include that part. He was just discussing my answer to his previous question, so I'll just delete that part. So The question is, does an Arya's equanimity, comma, or comma that ends, comma, protect them from harm whilst on the eightfold path to arahantship? Well, equanimity, I mean, you don't even have to really call it equanimity, comma. It's not really comma that ends, comma. Comma doesn't end, comma. Comma creates more comma. Or karma. I generally use the English word. The Sanskrit word is now English, karma, just because people understand it better. Also, it gets converted into an adjective better. Karmic makes more sense than comic, because comic might be misunderstood. So equanimity, karma, in a way, it would just be a much more subtle form of karma that isn't entangling you as much as most other karma would. It's not, I mean, calling it karma that ends karma is not technically correct. I mean, there is no karma that ends karma. There's karma that is just sort of like, I mean, you can call it like a dud karma, like equanimity karma. You can call it sort of a dud. It's like a bullet that doesn't go off. It's like a firecracker that won't explode. There's still something there, but it's just not making a lot of impact and creating more karma. It's just sort of a kind of neutralizing kind of mental state, equanimity. It's just not making new karma. It's not reinforcing old karma. So I think I'd quibble that it's not really karma that ends karma. It's just sort of a weaker, kind of more subtle kind of karma that consequently kind of like reduces the momentum of your karma just by not adding to it, or not adding very much to it anyway. So does equanimity protect people from harm whilst on the eightfold path to arahantship? To some degree. I mean, equanimity, first of all, it's like you're decreasing the momentum of your karma. And also, just the equanimity itself, when other karma arises, the fruition of other karma arises, you have something bad happening to you, for example, the equanimity kind of neutralizes that. You're not going to just spin off into misery or something because you're going to have the equanimity going. So I'm not sure if that's what quaesitor means, though. Quaesitor may think that if you've got equanimity, you're practicing equanimity, that it's going to prevent bad things from happening to you. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, to some degree, it can. It will reduce the amount of bad things that happen to you. But somebody who's really striving for enlightenment can still have bad things happen to them. It may be that they need bad things to happen to them to help slam them out of any ruts they happen to be in, or to force a kind of crisis that will then just kind of force them to make progress. So sometimes, like, harm may actually be a blessing in disguise. And I mentioned this family member I had in the past, who was kind of a superficial, kind of a selfish sort of person. And then she got cancer, and all of a sudden she's facing her own mortality. And even though she recovered, still, I mean, she was like a deeper, better person after that, just because she was having to face her own limited lifespan and just sort of questioning herself whether she was living her life the right way that she should be living it, and so forth. So still, I mean, you can be on the path to enlightenment, and it may be that you're sort of blocked because you have to have this bad thing happen to you. And, it's just, you're not ready until next time or something. There's also, I mean, there's so many complications. It's not just this cookbook, like an equation or something. It's so complicated. There's so many variables that you really can't just make a pronouncement one way or the other. But an Arya, his equanimity, certainly will protect his mind from making more bad karma when bad things happen to him. Whether or not bad things happen to him, the equanimity will prevent him from reacting with attraction or aversion. So, I mean, he will be making less karma because of that. But I don't think it's necessarily the case that the good karma that an Arya is making, the subtle, more advanced kind of karma that like a saint is making, even though he's not enlightened yet, is really going to necessarily protect him from bad things happening to him. It will reduce the odds of it, but still it may be that he just needs something bad to happen to him for whatever reason. So I don't know if I answered that question because I'm not 100% certain that I even understood that question. So I'm going to move on to Quaesitor's second question, which is easier to answer, I'm happy to say. Can ill will arise in the mind without our conscious participation and have karmic consequences? See, he wrote comic consequences, which is easy if you're reading it, but if you're just hearing it, you might misunderstand. So, ill will can arise in the mind without our conscious participation. Well, it's without our volitional participation. Like when a thought arises in your mind, when it first appears in your mind, that, from the Buddhist point of view, is the fruition of past karma. And so that is not a karmically, what's the word? A karmically active mental state. It's like just a fruition. Like when the first movement, as St. John of the Cross would say, the first movement arises in your mind, then that has no ethical quality. That's neither good nor bad. It could be a horrible thought, but you're not making new karma by thinking that horrible thought when it first appears. But if you follow along with that and continue with it, then you're making new karma. And St. John of the Cross, who was an extremely wise man, he was the father confessor at a convent for some time. And so he had, hyper conscientious nuns coming to him and confessing these thoughts that were arising in their mind. And he's telling them, if it first arises, you don't need to confess that. That's just, from the Buddhist point of view, past karma just coming to the surface. It's only if you latch onto those, you allow your thoughts to hook up in sequence, as Hui Neng would say, you just kind of go down the rabbit hole or whatever, then you're making new karma. But the first thought, it could be hate, it could be rage, whatever it is. If it just arises in your mind, that's just past karma, at the fruition stage. It's just working itself out, and you haven't done anything wrong, no matter how horrible the thought is, so long as you don't follow that thought and nurse it and continue with it. So I think I answered that question. And so I'm just going to move on to Quaesitor's third question, which is, you mention a difference in karma, from someone pushing a button versus someone stabbing someone. This is in the previous Q&A. Both acting with the intention to kill. Does this mean that karma is not specifically about what is right and wrong, but more to do with what the mental state is, regardless if the intention is the same? And then in parentheses, he's got, when I say the intention is the same, I mean they both have the base intention to kill, but perhaps there's a difference in the motivation and reason behind that intention. That's the end of the parentheses there. And then he continues, for example, the person stabbing someone on a battlefield, replaying that event in their mind, versus the person shielded from the visual impact of their actions, also taking into consideration that people react to things differently depending on upbringing and other factors like levels of spiritual attainment. So if an Arya kills, assuming they can, there would be less of a karmic consequence than if a non-Arya kills. Well, from the point of view of Orthodox Theravada, an Arya really cannot deliberately murder somebody, cannot deliberately kill somebody. It could be an accidental thing, like Padmasambhava dancing on a rooftop. I've read this in a biography of Padmasambhava. He's dancing on a rooftop and he kicks a rock off the roof and it falls down and it hits somebody in the head and kills them. And Padmasambhava just accepted no, he did not consider himself guilty of having done anything wrong. He said it was the karma of the person. I was just dancing. I did not do it deliberately. It just happened, nature taking its course. He was just sort of like a blind instrument. Nowadays, people might say different. He might get arrested depending on his ethnicity. He was North Indian, I guess. So I don't know how that would work out. So anyways, let's see here. I gotta tease out the actual questions here by searching for the question marks. So in the previous Q&A, I mentioned that the karma can be different on how you kill. There's two people kill somebody. One is just sitting in a computer room and launches a cruise missile, just pushes a button, and the cruise missile, flies 50 miles or whatever and blows up a building and maybe 30 people die. And then compare that with the way people killed each other in ancient times on a battlefield where you're armed with a sword or a spear and you're looking your enemy right in the eye and you're just killing him right in front of you. The karmic quality of the act is going to be different. And so, see, does this mean that karma is not specifically about what is right and wrong, but more to do with what the mental state is, regardless of if the intention is the same? Yeah. The intention is going to be like the will involved. There's always going to be subtle differences. It's not going to be exactly the same will. Even that one soldier in ancient times, he might kill 15 barbarian enemies during the same battle with his spear or whatever. And the volition may be slightly different for each one. It's not going to be exactly the same. It's not some kind of cookie cutter equation kind of a deal where if you do act A, you're going to have consequence B. It just doesn't really work that way. It's way more complicated and more subtle than that. So it is true that karma is not specifically about what is right and wrong, but more to do with your mental states, because karma is a mental state. Karma is essentially will, urge, volition. So right and wrong are not used a whole heck of a lot in Buddhist ethics. It's more skillful or unskillful. That which takes you closer to enlightenment or farther away from enlightenment. That which helps to free you from samsara or, entrap you, snare you in samsara, ensnare you. So, yeah, there's going to be all these subtle differences. And with regard to, Quesator brings up the idea that if you kill someone face to face, then you may be making more and more karma over the rest of your life, just recalling that and just going into these trains of thought, these trains of association, just thinking about it, maybe feeling guilt over it or whatever. And so if the coward sitting in the computer room just launching cruise missiles, he's not going to have that complication. He may still be thinking about it. Like one of the guys that dropped the A-bombs on Japan at the end of World War II, I think he committed suicide afterwards, just through remorse of what he had done. I don't think they told him that it was necessarily an atomic bomb he was dropping. I think he just thought he was dropping a regular bomb, which, it's hardly any better. You're still killing lots of people down there. But still, there's all these subtle differences that are going to affect your mind and thus affect the karma that you create through your mind, because of course karma is a mental state. It's not just some sort of undiscovered law of physics of, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's not Zeus up in heaven keeping score with regard to who needs what to happen back to them, anything like that. It's just the momentum of your own mental states. And water seeks its own level. Karma kind of seeks its own level. And so, how do I explain it? It's, I forgot even what I was trying to say. It happens sometimes. I need another drink. So, yeah, just the circumstances of how you're doing it. And one of the main factors of karma, not the only factor, but an important factor, is the emotional intensity of the act. So somebody like some sociopath with like ice water running through his veins, who is just pushing a button or launching missiles, I mean, it's going to be a very different quality of karma than somebody who just goes into a berserker rage on the battlefield and is just hacking and slashing and stabbing away. They might kill the same number of people, but the quality, how the karma is going to reach fruition and everything is going to be very different. It's not just some sort of equation, or at least it's a very complicated equation with lots of variables, and it's a different equation for each act. So let's see here. I think I answered that question. Maybe not very well. Lost the track at least once. Let's see here. Does this mean that karma is not specifically about what is right and wrong? I mean, right and wrong, or skillful and unskillful, are definitely major factors. But really, there's all these subtleties of your own reaction to what you did, which can result in making more and more karma. It's like the guy launching missiles. He might not even know if it hit anything. It might have got knocked down by an anti-missile defense system. It may have blown up an empty building that the enemy knew the missile was coming somehow. They evacuated the building, and then he blew up an empty building. It's like there's all these things. Like I came up with a thought experiment once of you could have somebody who accidentally kills someone and doesn't even know that they killed him. Let's say whatever it is, there's a new sheriff in town. Some cowboy shoots his gun up in the air and the bullet comes down a mile away and kills somebody, and he doesn't even know it. On the other hand, you've got somebody who has planned out this murder for months, and he's waiting with like a gun. He's got this rifle, like a sniper rifle. The person's walking by and he shoots for his head, and it was like when the person hears the shot, it startles them and they slip and fall. The guy misses, but he sees the guy go down after the shot. Then he just takes off. He's got the escape route already planned out. He gets on a plane, flies to Argentina, and spends the rest of his life thinking he killed this person. When the other guy, he thought it was just a car backfiring that just startled him, and he slipped and fell. He got back up, continued on his way, and it's no big deal. So what's the karma of these two people? You got one person who is oblivious to the fact that he really did kill somebody. And then you got the other person who thinks that he killed somebody, but really didn't. So, I mean, which one has worse karma? And in some ways, I think for the most part, the guy who thought that he was killing somebody, wanted to kill somebody, but didn't, had made worse karma than the guy who just accidentally killed somebody and didn't even know that he killed them. So, I mean, it's not just, if you do action A, it's going to result in karmic fruition B, anything like that. It's very subtle and complicated. And I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Thermal Squid, and I have to admit, I do admire the name of this individual. Thermal Squid is a good name. I like that name. And Thermal Squid says, would you agree that humor is a kind of ugliness with limited or no power to disgust? No, I wouldn't say humor is a kind of ugliness with limited or no power to disgust. I mean, some humor is like sick jokes, which can be very disgusting. Leper jokes. I had a roommate in college that specialized in leper jokes, or gross jokes, like when I was in like junior high school. I guess it's mostly called middle school. Gross jokes. Some of them could be fairly disgusting. I'm not even going to give an example. I have my own theory of humor. It's humor. It like gets like a certain intensity of seriousness going. You're taking somebody serious, at least to some degree, and then at the very end, the momentum of this serious narrative just evaporates into absurdity. And so you've got this energy that you've dedicated to making sense of what this person is saying. This sort of a concentration, a seriousness. You're taking it seriously. And then when you get to the end, this momentum is just diffuses. And so this energy that you've been dedicated to following the narrative or whatever. It just has to release itself through, say, tightening of facial muscles and like small convulsions of the diaphragm and so forth, as a kind of reflex. So I consider humor to be sort of like the unexpected evaporation of meaning, where, you're attributing a certain mental energy to making sense of a narrative, and then all of a sudden the whole sense of it just collapses. And so this energy that you've dedicated to making sense of it, of taking it seriously, it suddenly, it just has to like diffuse through, smiling or laughter or whatever. That's my theory, and which means that it is a theory which belongs to me. So let's see here. I'll just move on to Thermal Squid's next question. Do you feel that there is such a thing as irony poisoning? And fortunately, he gives a kind of commentarial explanation of what his question means, because if that's all there was to the question, I would be at a loss. So he says, with regard to irony poisoning, it is the phenomenon in the singular. It is the phenomenon of being so liberal and accepting of stupidity or ridiculousness that one's character or principles are compromised, essentially being entrenched in a jesting sentiment that gets one lost, or that one gets lost. Gosh, I think I was following along with that pretty well up until the final, just the very end of the sentence, of being the phenomenon of being so liberal and accepting of stupidity or ridiculousness that one's character or principles are compromised. That much I know happens. But then he says, essentially being entrenched in a jesting sentiment that one gets lost. The jesting sentiment, I'm not so sure about. Liberals who take very seriously people who identify as cats, and so that they are actually advocating for litter boxes to be put in public restrooms for just to accommodate the people who identify as cats. And I've heard of this actually happening in certain schools, where there's litter boxes in the girls' rooms because some of the female students identify as cats. But the liberals take that seriously. It's not like they're so accepting of stupidity and ridiculous that their character or principles are compromised, but it's compromised by taking that seriously, even though maybe deep down they realize that it's just a state of moral degeneracy for society. It's well into decline and fall, unless it gets turned around. So liberals who are so accepting of just the craziness of extreme leftists, like on Twitter or X recently, there was, I think he was a principal at a public school who was obviously a guy in drag with like really exaggerated lipstick and just like weird hair. It was, I'm sure this person preferred she, her pronouns, even though it was obviously a guy, like biologically. And so, it's like people who accept that. You've got transsexual Congress people, at least one now, that the people on the left especially, they have to take that so seriously that it's practically sacred. And I don't think that there's really that much of a jesting sentiment. I think deep down there's a certain cognitive dissonance that probably a lot of these people that aren't just completely brainwashed or conditioned, that deep down they have to know that this isn't right, which may help to account for a large number of leftists who are actually converting to voting Republican now because they just can't take it anymore. It's just becoming just too far out. But I've never really come across anyone who like takes that stuff semi-seriously, but then kind of makes a joke about it, or like, they know that it's absurd and they don't care, and then they just kind of become like toxic hypocrites or something. Yeah, I'm sure it exists. I mean, anything you can imagine. I mean, it's if it's possible, it's bound to happen sooner or later. There's all kinds of people out there, but yeah, I think for the most part, one of the signs of being like a hardcore liberal leftist, and I don't even like using the word liberal because technically I'm like a classical liberal. A classical liberal is very, very similar to a libertarian. So, I mean, like a Marxist really isn't a liberal. A neo-cultural Marxist is fairly different from like a John Stuart Mill brand liberal. So, I mean, if you're so leftist, you're so cultural Marxist that, I mean, one of the symptoms of that is you pretty much lose a sense of humor. That, I mean, jesting is almost taboo. I mean, you have to take it all seriously. You take everything seriously. I mean, the sense of humor is like gone. And I really don't think fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I think a sense of humor may be the beginning of wisdom. And they're losing even that much. That their sense of humor is just, they're taking everything deadly seriously. That their own side is completely right, no matter how bizarre their behavior is. And the other side, the conservative traditionalists, are just evil, and they take that seriously too. So there's really, like, comedy is pretty much dying out in the West due to this. I mean, they call it woke now, but it's just this far leftist distaste for any kind of humor because it might offend somebody. Making a joke about anybody may be offensive. So let's see here. Yeah, I'm sure there is such a thing as irony poisoning, but I don't think it's very common. It's rare, sort of like kuru or something. It's just not really a common thing because the jesting sentiment gets lost around the same time as all of this weird fringe leftist moral degeneracy stuff starts being taken so seriously that it becomes like sacred. And so I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question. Can stupidity be recreational? And again, he's got the helpful commentarial explanation here. I once remember having sordid words with a coworker where he responded to my accusation of idiocy with "only on Sundays," and I took that to heart, finding it supremely amusing. I feel as if it's perhaps the case that we could be so dumb that our activities might be considered like a craft to a fortunate witness. Gosh, I don't understand this question any better than I did before I read it. See here, can stupidity be recreational? Okay. And then his example, he had sordid words with a coworker where he responded to my accusation of idiocy with "only on Sunday." So he only admits to being an idiot on Sunday. And I took that to heart, finding it supremely amusing. I feel as if it's perhaps the case that we could be so dumb that our activities might be considered like a craft to a fortunate witness. The explanation, I think, has mystified me so that I understand the question even less. A craft to a fortunate witness. So, in other words, like somebody can act stupidly that can be interpreted like some kind of genius comedy by somebody else. I mean, obviously that can happen. Stupidity can be recreational. Well, obviously you can take drugs that make you stupid that are recreational. Drunkenness is a kind of recreational stupidity for a lot of people. I think you can have recreational stupidity. Like, for example, when I was young, my father was the same way. We liked associating with riffraff. And it's like riffraff, associating with riffraff actually does have certain advantages. For example, riffraff tend to be more, they're less hypocritical for the most part than if you went to a party. Like, I went to a few university parties that were like a prestigious university where you've got young guys or young people just kind of posing and projecting an image. And it wasn't a fun party at all. It's like everyone is like judging you and comparing you with their projected image and your projected image. And it was like they're just practicing for cocktail parties for some corporation or something. I mean, it was not a fun party going to that. But you go to a party with riffraff, there might be fist fights and people getting thrown through windows or whatever. But it's like what you see is what you get. You know, there's not a whole lot of hypocrisy going on. So associating with riffraff can be, I mean, in a way you have lowered expectations. And like with my father and me, we could just sort of automatically rise towards the top of the riffraff. You know, we were like lords of riffraff in a way, which is, I mean, that's rather than just being sort of a middle level elitist, you can be a prince of riffraff. So, I mean, there's that. And the whole reason I bring this up with regard to the question, can stupidity be recreational? Just hanging out with just dumb people who aren't even trying to be smart. You don't have to be smart when you're with them either. And it's just kind of, it's more fun in certain circumstances anyway. I mean, I wouldn't want to be that way all the time. I don't associate with riffraff much, although the new place where I'm working, there's people that probably could qualify as riffraff. So in a way, it's more relaxing, more conducive to ease, more peace of mind to some degree, even though, I mean, they're more likely to rip you off. You know, after you go out to your car, it might be that your car has been stolen, or the stereo has been taken out, or the tires have been slashed or something. I mean, that's always a hazard in associating with riffraff. But I mean, there is a certain amount of recreational stupidity involved. I mean, even setting aside drunkenness. But I don't fully understand Thermal Squid's question. He and Lieberlam, or Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, I mean, they're unintentionally rivals for like cerebral sort of questions that are difficult to understand sometimes. So I'm just moving on to the next question. And this is, I assume, from someone called Lao Thunda, although instead of A's, there are 4s. So Lao Thunda, I assume, is their name, or else it's Leforo Thundafor, says, there is a temple nearby, I'm in the US, by the way, that I don't go to, but my friend who's a sheriff informed of seeing monks in a courthouse to settle a dispute over property lines so that the temple can start expanding with a structure that might be on the neighbor's property. I thought monks weren't allowed to be involved with court things, and that the property line dispute should be handled by the trustees and kapias. Is this a case of how it's not possible to adhere to Vinaya in this Western modern day and age, as the courts need a name or representative to have a court case? Well, as far as I know, it's not against the monastic rules of discipline for a monk to attend a court hearing or, discuss something to a judge or to like a city council or something like that. When I was a monk, I was actually asked to come to I think it was a county council meeting over something kind of similar to this case that is given, in that the monastery I was staying at wanted to build a pagoda. And a lot of the neighbors were vehemently opposed to having a pagoda in their neighborhood. And so I was asked as a Westerner to go and present the case of the monastery to the the county council, and I would have done a fairly good job of it. But at the last minute, it was like one of the senior supporters, Burmese supporters of the monastery, his son got selected instead of me, and he gave this totally hokey, like a school book report kind of speech, completely rehearsed, all just written down, and really it did not persuade anybody, and the case was refused, and they couldn't go ahead and build the pagoda. It would have been a really pretty pagoda too, and there's a good chance I could have gotten the point across that it's completely harmless, and really it would just be this beautiful monument in the neighborhood. But so, I mean, there's no actual rule against that, so long as you're not discussing money or you're not trying to swindle somebody out of their property, something like that. So I don't think it's against Vinaya for a monk to attend some court proceeding. I mean, what would happen if a monk got called to jury duty? I mean, I don't think it would necessarily be against the rules of the rules of monastic discipline, unless maybe it was for some kind of death penalty offense, or maybe whether or not somebody should have to pay a fine, because monks aren't supposed to have anything to do with money. But just going and answering questions before a judge, there's no rule against that I'm aware of. So, I mean, you would have to look into, is there money involved? I mean, directly involved in the court proceedings. Are they discussing money, or are they trying to do anything dishonest, anything like that? That might qualify as some transgression of the rules of discipline. But just going to a court proceeding over discussing matters of fact, like where the actual property line is, I don't think that that's against the rules. So I'm just going to move on to Lao Thunda, or Laforo Thundafor's next question, which is, what is the ethics of the case where a temple resells, or puja, pronounced bucha in Lao and Thai, sangadana, that monks can't use, and give the okay reasoning of the reselling or puja as to help pay for the utility bills? And the devotees are just trying to help collect the donations in quotes. I'm sure the volunteers don't incur negative karma, but how does it affect the Sangha of monks? There is some complication in this, and I think there are rules that kind of can go both ways. I was taught that it is a tulachaya offense, which is a relatively serious offense. It's a more serious ecclesiastical offense than killing an animal or telling a lie, for like giving away or getting rid of Sangha property. But there's some loophole kind of rule that does get made use of, where a monastery, they can take monastery property and exchange it for something of equal value or something like that. It's very obscure. I'd never really studied it much because I just avoided that kind of situation when I was a monk. I just tended not to give away monastery property or Sangha property, just going with the idea that there is a rule that declares that to be a serious offense. And there may be a kind of loophole to that. I assume there is, but I really didn't study up on that. What is the ethics of the case where a temple resells Sangadama, which is just stuff that was donated to the Sangha that monks can't use? Yeah, I mean, that is kind of a problem where monks are accepting stuff that they can't use. I mean, sometimes, when I first got to Burma, somebody wanted to offer me something, and I said, really, I don't have any use for that. And then some other person kind of stepped in and said, oh, you must never say that because you're denying these lay people the opportunity to earn merit by donating to you. And that's the way the Burmese see it. They don't care if the monks need anything or not. They just want to get merit by offering stuff. And so there are monks in Burma that will have an entire storeroom full of laundry detergent, for example, soap and toothpaste, laundry detergent, all the stuff that is donated at a rate of 20 times the rate at which it's actually getting used. And so it just builds up and builds up and builds up. And I mean, it can be somewhat problematic of a situation. And in a case like that, I mean, it would make sense for monks to give it away, give it away to people that it's allowable to give stuff to, like to the monastery attendants. You just do whatever you want with this. We don't need it. That kind of thing. I mean, it would be understandable, especially if it was not donated to the Sangha in general, but donated to an individual monk. He can give that sort of way. Although still there are rules that discourage that. You're giving away a gift of faith. That's a minor offense. So, I mean, it's very, you can find rules that can sort of justify going either way. There's rules against it and allowing it at the same time. And it depends on how you navigate the complexities of these rules, which, which gives rise to the old Burmese saying that if you're skillful at Vinaya, you can kill a chicken. If you know all the loopholes, that you can do damn near anything you want. Like Mahayana monks eating dinner and calling it the medicine meal. Because you're not allowed to eat food in the afternoon, but you can take medicine in the afternoon. So we just call the food medicine. Or some of the rules, like even the strict monks, Ajahn Tanisaro endorses this. A monk is only allowed to keep 3 robes, which is 3 rectangles of cloth, which is upper, lower, and outer. And you can wear them all at the same time. You get 1 suit of clothes. You can have anything in addition to that. You can keep it for 10 days, and you got to get rid of it within 10 days, or else you have broken a Nisagiya Pachitiya rule, which means you have to forfeit the transgressive extra robes, and then you have to make confession. And the way, like monks of the Thai forest tradition, they just call it accessory cloth. You're allowed to keep accessory cloth, which is like bags and water filters and, handkerchiefs, that kind of thing. So they just call it accessory cloth, and then they just keep as many robes as they want. They can have 50 robes, so long as they don't call them robes. But obviously, it's robes. So there's all these loopholes. But I've kind of digressed my way away from this question. What is the ethics of the case where a temple resells Sanghadana that monks can't use and give the okay reasoning of the reselling or puja as to help pay for the... Well, I mean, if they're reselling anything, that should be entirely the call of the lay people, and they would take upon themselves the duty or the responsibility. If the monks, just make it clear that they don't care, then, I mean, they might be committing a minor offense by allowing monastery property to be pilfered, but I doubt even that. So it's like you could have sort of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of a situation where the monks say, look at this, all this stuff here, we got no use for it. And then they just kind of like wink and walk away. And then the monastery attendants say, well, we should sell this and make some money to put into the community fund for the monastery. Then really, there'd be no evil deeds going on there. There's all these loopholes, like it's against the rules for a monk to damage plants or to cause others to damage plants. So what do? You're living in a temple in the West where you've got shrubberies, you've got a lawn that needs mowed, you've got flower beds. You're not allowed, not only can monks not weed the garden or mow the lawn or anything like that themselves, they can't even ask others to do it. So the trick is, like this is done a lot in relatively strict monasteries in Burma, you just say, kapiyam grohi, make it allowable. You just point at this tree, say, make it allowable, which means cut the tree down. But because you didn't say cut the tree down, you just said make it allowable, then somehow you're off the hook. And me answering this question in a very roundabout way is I'm just going on these sort of semi-rants in various directions. But, if monks are involved in selling anything, even if it's their own property, it's regardless of whether it's owned by the Sangha, owned by the monastery, owned by an individual monk, still, you're breaking the rules by selling something or even causing somebody else to sell it. So probably the best case scenario, they have all this stuff they don't need. then they just say, well, they just say to a monastery attendant, board of trustee of the board of directors or whatever, to say, we don't need this stuff. We don't really care what happens to it. And then they just walk away and let the lay people take care of it. That might be a loophole that allows them to get rid of Sangha property without breaking a rule. But selling anything, monks aren't supposed to be involved in that. Paying utility bills is also something a monk shouldn't be involved in. Even if they're going to get really cold, if the utility bills aren't paid, that's just too bad. And I've said enough on that. I'm just going to move on to the next question, or else I could just continue ranting and digressing for another 15 minutes easily. So, the next question is from Rui. And Rui says, how did your sitting practice bleed into the rest of your everyday existence? Well, that's a good question, and kind of a subtle one. And sometimes it's not really clear exactly how your sitting practice influences the rest of your everyday existence. Although, for starters, you get a more quiet mind, more clarity, which then has a certain momentum that even after you get up and start moving around, especially if you're meditating and like doing mindfulness meditation, you're doing like subtle mindfulness when you're sitting there with your eyes closed, and that helps you to be mindful throughout the rest of the day when you're moving around making noise. So that's one way of doing it. I mean, also you may have certain profound experiences, sort of like a psychedelic drug experience also, even though, it's in the past, but still you have the memory of that. It had its influence. It gives you like an extra frame of reference, so to speak, which can then also influence you like in your everyday life. You can remember certain insights that you have had, which can influence pretty much, anything in life after that. So I guess just, adding momentum to mindfulness in general, because you get into deeper levels of it, or can anyway, when you're sitting motionless. And also just the insights that you have through meditation just stay with you after you're not meditating. It's just sort of a memory that you can fall back on. It's something that's there that you can exploit, so to speak. See, besides that, my sitting practice, how did it bleed into the rest of my everyday existence? I guess those would be the two main ways. There might be other ways that I'm just not thinking of right now. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from somebody who calls himself Kyundru and also not Kyundru. So this is kind of a paradoxical person here who is called Kyundru and not Kyundru simultaneously. And Kyundru, or not Kyundru, says, are there any memorable things that have been placed into your alms bowl? Yeah, there have been a few things. In fact, 3 things immediately come to mind when I was asked that by Kyundru and not Kyundru. One was, I was going for alms in this poor village in central Burma. It's called Lamyana village. And a woman called Siyama, which means that she's either a teacher or a nurse, probably, offered something into my bowl. It was kind of yellow and kind of these weird lumpy shapes. And she was like one of the first people to put food in my bowl. And I didn't want to stand there staring at it to see what it was. That would be kind of rude. So I just continued on my way. More food got put in, and I forgot about the yellow lumpy things. Till finally, I'm back at the cave in central Burma. And I'm going through my food, and I find one of those lumpy things. There was like 5 of them. And they were like whole frogs that were cut in half. I had 3 front halves and 2 back halves. I picked one of them up, and it was like this frog kind of staring at me like this. And I couldn't bring myself to eat them, pretty sure. If I remember correctly, I didn't eat them. Although I have eaten frog legs before. You get these little frogs like this big. You pick off this little pea-sized bit of meat off the thigh and eat that. I've done that before. So there is that. And then I remember one time I was living at Mahagandayam, which was a big school monastery on the outskirts of Mandalay in the city of Amarapura, which was the capital of Burma at one time, briefly. And I used to walk across this rickety teak bridge built, I think, in the early 1800s called Upain Bridge, Upain Dada. And there was a village, Tantaman village, on the other side. And before I got to the bridge, I walked past a number of these little like stalls that were selling food and so forth. And some guy came out and he offered me these, it looked like little sausages. And he explained it to me. He said, in my sort of Burmese English, pish, which he's trying to say fish, but there is no F in the Burmese language. So he says pish. And it was a kind of like fish sausage, like surimi kind of stuff, like the kind of stuff that fake crab meat is made out of. And so I just continue on my way. And I come back from Tauntaman village and everything, come back to my meditation cabin at the monastery. I sit down and I take a bite into something that tasted really, really strong of fish. And I thought, it's that stuff that guy gave me. And I mean, it was just really this overpowering smell and taste of this beyond fish. And I figured, I mean, this stuff's going to give me the trots tonight. This stuff went bad. And so I'm trying to pick out any of it that I found. And I see some movement in my bowl. And I look, and there's a great big blowfly maggot, like this long, like crawling up the side of my bowl. And it's like, man, it's that rotten fish that this guy gave me. So that was kind of memorable. And I did have the trots all night that night. That happens a lot in Burma. Like you go for alms round in some village where they don't have electricity or refrigeration. Stuff goes bad fast. Some food is just danger food, like shrimp. You eat shrimp at your peril. You know, if you're out in a village, you get some shrimp curry or something. It's a coin toss as to whether or not you're going to be making midnight trips to the outhouse. Also, something like already peeled pineapple. For some reason, when I'd be out in like this semi-desert area and get pineapple that was already peeled into my bowl, pretty much every time I ate it, I'd wind up like taking like desperate baby steps to the outhouse in the middle of the night. Because you can't take big steps. You gotta be walking like this, really fast baby steps like this, because you gotta keep that sphincter clenched for all you're worth, so that you're not going potty before you get to the outhouse. So there's that. I mean, on a lighter note, I guess, in the city of Meitila in central Burma, south of Mandalay, that's the only place I've ever gone for alms as a monk where you can get betel quids. That some people will just put betel quids into your bowl. And by betel, I don't mean insects. It's the areca nut, which has a mild stimulant effect wrapped in it's a kind of pepper leaf called a betel leaf. And sometimes there's other ingredients for flavoring. Sometimes a little bit of tobacco will be put in. And guys in Southeast Asia chew those sort of like chewing tobacco in the West. And I was always kind of curious about it. And somebody put this little package of already wrapped little betel quids into my bowl. So I experimented to see what chewing betel was like. And I mean, it had kind of a similar effect as like smoking a cigar. You know, you still get like that mild buzz from it or something. But it really wasn't for me. And it turns your slobber into like ketchup with this strong vinegary smell. Oh, lime. Like not the citrus fruit, but the mineral lime. I don't think it's quick lime. I think it's like slaked lime or whatever. That's one of the ingredients. And the betel, the areca nut, and your slobber and the lime cause this chemical reaction that turns your slobber into this thick ketchupy stuff, which is really disgusting. So I suppose I could come up with some more memorable things. I had goldfish in my bowl. I couldn't bring myself to eat goldfish. There's, you know, little goldie. It looked so cute. I couldn't bring myself to eat that. I've had like roasted, let's see, what are they? Passer domesticus. I can remember the scientific name more easily. Oh gosh, God watches sparrows. Yeah, sparrows. They'll eat, Burmese people will eat sparrows, and it's like a whole sparrow with just the feet and the beak cut off. The whole rest of it, it's like the feathers all burn off in the fire or something. You just get this very crunchy little bird. So, yeah, I've had those in my bowl before, but I'm just gonna move on here. The next question is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, in your translation, and I'm looking, it's already been more than 2 hours. Yeah, I kind of figured this was going to be kind of a long one. Philalethes says, in your translation of Atthaka Wagga 11:13, it says that he for whom form has become void has no perception of perception and no perception of non-perception. And after that, it goes on to say that he is not without perception. And then it goes further and says that yet he has no perception of void. I remember when I read it, I couldn't make head or tails of this. Please explain. Okay. And then he's got kind of his own interpretation, but I think we're kind of pressed for time now a little bit due to my multiple digressions and semi-rants. But yeah, I mean, for example, I did a video on Zen koans just like a month ago, and I brought up that verse. It's from the Kalahawiwara Sutta of the Sutta Nipata, and it says with regard to presumably an enlightened being, he has no perception of perception, he has no perception of non-perception, he is not without perception, and he has no perception of void. And it's like a Zen koan. It's like a riddle. It's like a paradox or an enigma. And I think it was done that way deliberately. It's supposed to be difficult to understand. Although if you want an explanation of it, the explanation would be that you're no longer centered at the level of perception. And so perception becomes irrelevant. The enlightened being has a semblance of perception still going on. It's just that he is not stuck in that anymore. And so the actual perceptions become irrelevant. In a way, they're denatured. So they're like neutralized perceptions. They don't have a karmic quality anymore because an enlightened being is no longer creating karma. And any kind of perception has volition, cetana, involved with it, which is karma. So in a way, an enlightened being is kind of creating karma, but not really, because it's only the hollow semblance of karma with the hollow semblance of perception. And again, it requires thinking at two levels simultaneously in order to really start to even begin to wrap your head around it. And a lot of people can't do it. I hope Philalethes is capable of that. Because otherwise, it's just going to remain this paradox. It's like a Zen koan. So, I mean, just accept it as a Zen koan if it doesn't make sense. Because that's kind of what it was intended to be. Which is one of the reasons why the Atthaka Wagga is considered by some to be a kind of proto-Zen. It's like the roots of Zen koans, like found even in the earliest texts. So, I guess I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' second question. Did the Atthaka Wagga and archaic Buddhism influence your decision to stop being a Theravada bhikkhu? No, they actually influenced my decision to start being a Theravada bhikkhu, and the Atthaka Wagga helped me to remain a bhikkhu for as long as I did, because the Atthaka Wagga says that you're better off not believing anything. So you come across all this stuff that you can't believe in the texts that, like a traditionalist Burmese Buddhist just accepts without question, like a medieval European Catholic just accepts the whole Bible as literal gospel truth, that I just could not do that. And so I would find consolation in the Atthaka Wagga, where it says, don't believe anything, which was actually helpful for me. So it didn't influence my decision to stop being a bhikkhu. It was influenced my decision to become one in the first place, and it helped me to remain one for 30 years. But yeah, it had really nothing to do with me no longer being a bhikkhu. So let's see here. I'll just move on to Phil Lathy's third question. What do you do for fun besides work on your aquarium? Well, I kill zombies on my phone. I've got this app that allows me to kill zombies remotely as a kind of public service, which is kind of satisfying. And I still, I surf the web, still read some stuff. It's mostly on the computer screen now rather than on a paper book. I haven't read a paper book in a long time. Hang out with my sweetie. That's fun. Eat food. Eating food can be fun, especially because my woman is an excellent cook. Hell, sometimes even work can be fun. I'm getting the hang of this new kind of forklift operation. Let's see, what else? Hang out with friends, although my woman and I are both pretty much asocial and don't hang out with friends very much. And let's see, what else? Sometimes just going to the grocery store and going up and down all the aisles can be fun. But that may indicate that I'm just like an old man or something. But I mean, you can have fun doing just about anything, really. So, yeah, and work on my aquarium. I'm not really working very much. I'm just kind of feeding the fish every day, pruning back the hornwort occasionally. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. PSA says, do you think our lives in samsara can be compared to the Truman Show? And Truman slowly figuring out everything is fake is similar to a person slowly waking up. Well, that's pretty obviously the symbolic meaning of the Truman Show. In fact, there are a lot of these kind of science fiction-y virtual reality movies, including The Matrix, The 13th Floor, Existence. Sometimes it's a video game. Sometimes it's just a simulation. But people kind of thinking the simulation in the game or in this just the simulation is real and then gradually figuring out that it isn't. I mean, that's a pretty common theme in some science fiction movies. Like Avalon. It's one of my favorite movies. It's an excellent movie. And it's another kind of Truman Show kind of a thing. It's about a video game where people can get lost in the video game and they start thinking the video game is real. And then it turns out that the people that are playing the video game are themselves in a kind of simulation. And so it's kind of like the 13th Floor also, where the people that think they're in reality really, I mean, they're the ones entering the simulation, but they themselves are in a higher simulation. So there's quite a few movies like that. And the symbolism is pretty obviously the Truman Show. Like there's that one point, I saw the Truman Show more than 10 years ago. I saw it only once. It's certainly not my favorite of these virtual reality, like parable science fiction movies. That I'd have to put The Matrix well above the Truman Show and Avalon also. But I do vaguely remember there's the scene where the creator of the Truman Show is like trying to talk sense to Truman. It's like saying, I am your father kind of stuff. And obviously he's supposed to be like the demiurge or sort of the god that's creating the fake reality that we are living in. So yeah, it's pretty obvious. It's obvious symbolism. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, thoughts on the UFO phenomenon, ? And my thoughts on the UFO phenomenon are mainly, I think that the standard explanation favored by the ufologists is the least likely to be correct. Like a lot of these UFO people, the ufologists, they sincerely believe that UFOs are flesh and blood space aliens flying through light years of space in nuts and bolts spacecraft to come to Earth to warn us about the dangers of nuclear power and to take tissue samples, that kind of thing. And I think that's probably the least likely explanation. I mean, some of it is just misidentified objects, especially nowadays with drones, all sorts of weird phenomena like Starlink and satellites and all this. A lot of it is just I mean, it's literally a UFO because it's unidentified, but it could be identified as something mundane. Another thing is a lot of it is just fake, frauds, hoaxes. That explains a lot of it. But with regard to some of it, I do think that UFOs are more of a paranormal phenomenon than flesh and blood space aliens flying through light years of space in nuts and bolts spacecraft to visit this planet. That I think that some of it is just this paranormal, just weird phenomena that are sort of slipping through the cracks into our version of reality. I think that would explain a lot of the genuine UFO phenomena that can't be explained as hoaxes or just misidentified mundane objects. And another possibility is that UFOs are like from an alternate Earth, like an alternate human race that is probably more advanced than our human race, or something similar to humans, but more advanced than us, that have developed the ability, technologically or psychically or whatever, to bleed through probability into our version of reality, maybe as like anthropologists studying, like a species that's similar to their own, or like would have been their own species, but we branched off in a different probability, at whatever time. That something like that would be much more likely, because another universe, is just a quarter of an inch away. You just move sideways through probability, and you don't have to fly millions and millions of miles through outer space. You just go through this, bleed through into a different version of the same reality or whatever. So I think that's possible. But I continue to think that the least plausible explanation is the flesh and blood space aliens from another planet flying in spacecraft through outer space to get here. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from David. And David says, if suffering arises from desire, is the desire to end suffering itself a form of suffering? And yes, it may be the last kind of suffering that you have to let go of. That's kind of the way a lot of spiritual practice works, is a person will sort of break their attachments to almost everything, but they'll still have this one last attachment to becoming enlightened. They'll renounce the world, they'll break their family ties, leave behind their friends and all that, and just single-mindedly strive for enlightenment. But they can't become enlightened because they still have this one attachment, and that's the attachment for enlightenment itself. So eventually they're going to have some insight experience where they let go that last attachment, and then they can become enlightened. So yeah, it's subtle. It's more of a wholesome desire. It's more of a wholesome suffering, but still it's something that has to be let go of before you can become fully enlightened. So I'm just going to move on to David's second question. If enlightenment is the cessation of seeking, can the desire to cease seeking be the barrier that prevents it? And yeah, it's just pretty much just replacing desire with seeking from the previous question. So I think I'm just going to move on to David's third question. I have read about a procedure in which Burmese monks attempt to make themselves immortal. It involves being sealed into a wooden coffin alive and entering meditation. After a predetermined time, the coffin is opened, and if the body is gone, the monk has been fully successful, a shin tuet, or one which exits alive. If the body is there but incorruptible, then it is partly successful, a thay tuet, or one who exits through death. If upon opening the coffin the body is there and rotting like an ordinary body, the person has been unsuccessful and has died a mortal like a regular human. Have you encountered or heard about this practice in Burma, and would this person be considered enlightened? It appears that it might be possible to escape the wheel of rebirth without becoming enlightened? Well, in my approximately 24 years in Burma, I never heard of this once. It certainly is not mainstream Buddhism. And from the sound of it, it's probably a kind of alchemical sect of monks. There are monk alchemists out there. They're not mainstream. They're kind of a fringe phenomenon in Burma. They're trying for immortality or for converting base metals into gold, like medieval alchemists in the West, trying to find the philosopher's stone or whatever. And it's not Orthodox Buddhism. Like, according to Orthodox Buddhism, I mean, you just cannot become immortal. It's just not going to happen. Anything that has a beginning has an end. Everything is conditioned. Everything is inconstant. So, yeah, if this exists, I assume it, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if it does, even though I never heard of it in 24 years, 30 years of being a monk in a Burmese tradition, never heard of it once. But I have heard about Burmese alchemists. And some of them are ordained monks that are practicing alchemy. And they consider the alchemy to be more important than practicing Dhamma. And their attempts at becoming immortal are just an obvious case of this, because it's pretty basic Buddhism that you cannot be immortal. I mean, there's sort of the karmic stream that is, in a sense, is immortal, even though it's constantly changing and doesn't remain the same from one moment to the next. But this is a different kind of immortality. It's like the immortality of the individual personality, which, I mean, it's just sort of alchemy masquerading as Buddhism. So whether any of this actually happens or not, like the Ashin Tuet, where they meditate inside of a coffin, and then when the coffin is opened, there's nobody there anymore. Where would they go? Possibly like the Zojis, which are also a kind of alchemist, a Burmese alchemist. They live in the Himalayas where nobody sees them. So, I mean, but the earth is going to die eventually. Even this earth is not permanent. So what's going to happen to them then? They'd be in some other kind of world, but any kind of world is going to be impermanent. Not just the individuals inhabiting that realm. The realm itself is going to pass away eventually. At least the material realms. There might still be formless heaven realms that are still there, even though they're changing from moment to moment and don't have an abiding self-essence. So, yeah, in conclusion, I would just say that this sounds very much like a school of Burmese alchemy, like monastic alchemists who are taking alchemy more seriously than they are taking Dhamma, than they're taking Buddhism. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Mumumox. And Mumumox says, in an older video, you mentioned a Thai forest monk who has telepathic powers. Do you remember what his name is? And no, I do not. I just happened to be visiting Pa'aut Doya in southern Burma, and I was speaking with a German monk there. And the German monk advised me that if I spend any time in Thailand, I should seek out this monk and talk with him, because he can clearly read your mind. And he'll make it clear that he can read your mind. And also he said that he's not that far from the Bangkok airport. You know, not a very long drive to go see him if I happen to be stopping in Bangkok. But, I mean, this was back in like the 1990s. Whether he's still alive or not, I don't know. But maybe you could ask around with monks in a Thai tradition that would be more familiar with Thai monks in Thailand than I am. So, sorry about that. I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Trzaskaziz. And I wonder if Avenity calls him Trzaskaziz sometimes now. Anyways, Trzaskaziz says, could you say something more about your new book? Like what is or will be in it? Yeah, I'm working on a 4th volume, which probably could have been done by now if I had only gotten the idea earlier during the month when I wasn't working to start editing it. And it wasn't until like my last week that I thought, hey, I could be editing that book right now. So I had most of the material for it already written. I just need to edit it together, compile. It's going to be the same format as the first three, which is a collection of essays, except the main theme of this fourth book that I'm working on, and I'll probably edit a few more chapters tomorrow, is just personal experiences as a monk, both in Asia and in America, mostly in Asia, but there's going to be some like memoirs from my attempts of being a monk in America also. So it's going to be less philosophical and more personal experience oriented, this fourth book. And I'm more than halfway done editing it. So it'll probably be up. It'll probably be available on Amazon by, March at the latest, I hope. I'm editing like maybe 4 chapters per week now that I'm working, full time again. So, and I think it's Memoirs from Myanmar, the path of an incendiary Western Buddhist monk, something like that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jules. And Jules says, do you think different ethnicities may be biologically hard-coded or predisposed for varying spiritual experiences? And that's an interesting question. It's like an intriguing question. And I can't really say for sure. And I would assume that most of the differences for spiritual experiences in different ethnicities would be more cultural, just a different way of thinking and looking at the world and interpreting reality. That, it'd be a pre-modern society would be more likely to be mystically inclined, for example, and more religious than philosophical. And then you'd have sort of, like more modernistic Western, especially technological kind of societies would be more philosophically inclined and trying to understand things, more of a jnana yoga kind of approach to the spiritual path. But how much of it would be genetic with regard to insights that arise, or, how you'd have spiritual experiences? It could be possible. I mean, some ethnicities may be just more prone to a mystical approach, and other ethnicities may be more, just more genetically designed towards a more philosophical approach. They're just more cerebral for whatever reason, not just culturally, but also genetically. So, I mean, there may be differences like that, although I do think that most differences in like spiritual development, spiritual experiences, most differences between ethnicities are going to be more cultural than like genetic, biological. But I mean, it's something that I've never really seen much evidence, trying to explain, to verify it or debunk it or explain it or anything. It's an interesting question, one that I've never really thought about much. So I really can't say for sure, but my best guess would be there may be subtle differences, but most of the differences between ethnicities are going to be cultural more than genetic. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Waifu Body Pillow, also known as Airain. She has changed her moniker on Discord for her own reasons. So, Waifu Body Pillow, also known as Airain, says, do you think the 12 days of Christmas could be compared to Tantra in Buddhism? In British history, people would essentially break various rules and norms during the time around Christmas. Gluttony, heavy drinking, sloth and not working, ceremonially whipping children, allowing children to rule over the adults and the church for a day. It seems like this Christian celebration could be an archetypal version of Tantra in Buddhism. How would you compare them from a Buddhist perspective? Well, I'm not so sure whether it'd be a Buddhist perspective or not, but what waifu body pillow is talking about here is like traditionally around Christmas time, like the 12 days of Christmas, it was like carnival. It was similar to like the Catholic carnival before Easter or before Lent, I mean. And it derived, you'd have like the Lord of Misrule, where somebody would be chosen, usually, some drunk or, like the least likely person would be chosen Lord of Misrule to be sort of like the master of ceremonies of the revelry during this Christmas time. And this is evolved from the ancient Roman festival of Saturnalia, which occurred around the same time, right at the end of the year, around the time of the winter solstice, which is at the time of making this video today. And so it was a different kind of purpose than Buddhist Tantra. Saturnalia, and also later this traditional quasi-Christian revelry that would happen, you would have a kind of moral chaos at the end of the year to sort of burn it out of the system, to purify the society before the beginning of the next year. So as you would have like this time of like everything being backwards and chaotic, masters serving slaves, have the drunkest fool become just like the leader, everything backwards, everything just topsy-turvy and chaotic at the end of the year, to get that out of the system so that you would have more of a pure start for the new year. And anyone who has read The Golden Bough, James Frazier's The Golden Bough, a classic in early Western anthropology, cultural anthropology, knows what I'm talking about. There was one case that I think he was a Christian martyr named John, or whatever the version of John he went by. It was a version that translates into English as John, during the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, which is like the end of the 3rd century. So it's getting well into the Roman Empire times. There's already a lot of Christians by that time. And one of them being this Roman soldier stationed on the Danube named John. And it was the tradition on the Danube, which is kind of out in the provinces in 4th or 3rd century Rome, that you'd have a king of the Saturnalia. At the beginning of Saturnalia, you'd have a king chosen by lot. And this king of the Saturnalia could do anything he wanted. He would have a small group of soldiers with him, and he could walk through the marketplace, just take whatever he wanted. He could take any woman he wanted. He could take any boy he wanted. He could walk into anybody's house, do anything that he wanted, commit any atrocity. He was completely sacrosanct. He was completely beyond any kind of rules. He could do anything he wanted. But at the end of the Saturnalia, the last day, he had to go to the nearest temple of the god Saturn and sacrifice himself on the altar by cutting his own throat. And this was fairly common. This kind of thing was fairly common in ancient times. And there was still the holdover well into modern times in England and other European countries as this vestige of the Saturnalia. I mean, you wouldn't have human sacrifice anymore. Even that was kind of vestigial by the time of, the Emperor Diocletian. It probably had already been done away with in the big cities, but out on the provinces, in the relatively rural areas, it may still have been a thing. So, and the reason we know about this is that there was this Roman soldier named John. He was a Christian. And he got chosen by lot to be king of the Saturnalia. And he just refused, as a devout Christian, to spend his last week on earth just engaging in just the most reprehensible debauchery, and then to commit suicide in a pagan temple. And so he was executed, probably by his centurion, put to death for refusing to participate in this old ceremony. So I do think that's very different in its purpose from Tantra. Tantra is you're trying to like neutralize worldliness by doing like worldly acts, like having sex, for example, in a state of like mindful detachment. You're trying to cultivate the ability to perform like stereotypically immoral acts with enough detachment that it really doesn't sully you. You know, you're making as little bad karma as possible while doing these things by, in a way, like training yourself to do it with like equanimous mental states, you know, philosophical detachment. You can, you know, drink alcohol, eat meat, and so forth. And you're doing it with this moral detachment that makes it not so bad, because we are living in the Kali Yuga and sainthood is considered by tantricists, whatever they're called, to be really no longer a viable option. So you have to learn how to navigate a more degraded, like degenerate kind of samsara wisely. And so that's what Tantra is trying to do, is trying to like live in the world, but not of the world, essentially, using biblical terms. Whereas the 12 days of Christmas, in this Lord of Misrule kind of sense, which is derived from the Saturnalia, had this different purpose. It was more at a cultural, social level, and it was just burning off the chaos deliberately to try to purify the society right before the new year starts, so that you can start the new year relatively clean and straight, which is kind of a symbolic magic. You know, it's sympathetic magic, I guess you'd call it. So it's the purpose, the underlying purpose of it is different from Tantra, and the whole way you went about it is different from Tantra. Like in Saturnalia and the later, you know, the merriment, the festivities of the 12 days of Christmas, you just have roaring drunkenness. Whereas in Tantra, you'd be drinking a little bit of alcohol ceremonially and trying not to become a roaring drunk. So yeah, it's like the whole philosophical foundation of it is considerably different between the two traditions. And so I'm just going to move on to Waifu Body Pillow's second question, which is, do you think imposter syndrome is a common internal feeling among Buddhist monks because of the incredibly high standards you are held to? And imposter syndrome, as I understand it, is the belief that like you're just an imposter, you're not really good enough to get the respect and the prestige and the status that you've got. And I mean, I'd had twinges of that. I remember one time when I was still a very junior monk. I'd been in Burma for just a matter of months at this point. And there was a woman bowing down to me, and she was a fairly attractive younger woman. And I just had this flash of feeling, gosh, I wish I could see her ass better, because she's kind of bent over and everything. And I was just beating myself up for hours after that, saying, man, I'm supposed to be a holy man, you know? And I just had this lustful thought that I was kind of indulging in, trying to check out this woman who's bowing down to me. So I just felt unworthy at times like that. Before I became a monk, it was even more just, I was very worried that I would be unworthy of being a monk, because I had these naive ideas that a monk is just this saintly, sage-like philosopher, ascetic, striving for enlightenment. And ideally, that's what it is. And then you become a monk and you look around, you see that there's damn few of those kind of monks. There still are a few, but they are definitely in a tiny minority, statistically speaking. And I assume that there are some monks who just consider themselves to be, they secretly consider themselves to be unworthy of being monks. I never really saw any clear signs of it, though, other than, you know, a few twinges that I experienced myself. Because I was as a general rule, up until towards the very end, I was striving to be as good of a monk as I could. And then, I mean, coming to America is, it's like more advanced level when you're trying to be a good monk in America for various reasons. But you're alone in a Burmese forest. It's the distractions and the allure of, other things, they're kept at a minimum. So, yeah, I would have to say that, there are some that do have this kind of feeling of being unworthy. I mean, when I was first exposed to this question, it reminded me of my father, who had kind of a similar experience from being a soldier in World War II, where he survived. Like some of his comrades that he considered to be better men than he was, they got blown up, they got killed. And he somehow, this sort of unworthy drunk of a guy that he considered himself to be at the time, he survived, and he just had a certain amount of guilt over that better men than he was got killed and he didn't. So, I mean, I assume that it's fairly common in human beings to have feelings like this. I think that what my father was feeling is not so different from what waifu body pillow is mentioning here, of just this feeling of kind of guilt and unworthiness. But one of the things that I've really taken to heart in Buddhism is that a guilty conscience is always a bad thing. That remorse or regret, self-reproach in a negative kind of way is, it always just makes things worse. That, you could argue that remorse can actually prevent you from doing the same thing again. And that is true, but ideally you can just know that you did wrong and acknowledge that and determine that you're going to do better next time without having to beat yourself up over it, without the regret and remorse, which is called kukucha in Pali, and it is an unwholesome mental state. So, yeah. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Enigma. And it looks like, we're already at 3 hours. This is going to be one of the longest ones. It'll be less than 3.5. We're getting down towards the bottom here. This is from Enigma. And Enigma says, I read a long time ago that in Sanskrit, there are multiple words for different mental states that miss in Western languages. When trying to understand karma from a Western point of view, how well do the cultural semantics of words like mind and mental momentum translate from Buddhist semantics? For example, I can't translate mind from English to my native language, having two different words for it, where neither carries the meaning of mind appropriately. So I normally just stick to use the English word. So when karma and the fruits of it are a manifestation of physical reality through mental momentum, to understand karma requires to have the right view on mental states and mental momentum. How much differences are there from the cultural semantics of a Western experience mind to ancient Indian classic Buddhist experience and understanding of mind and mental state? How well does the translation of conscious and subconscious fare without having a wrong view as a Westerner? Well, that is a problem with regard to a language barrier and a culture barrier, that obviously modern Westerners are going to understand reality, understand samsara, and also understand dharma differently from an ancient Indian, from the Ganges Valley. So, I mean, there's always going to be this trouble. I mean, the Bible is the same. The Bible gets translated. There just is, between two languages, unless they're very similar languages, like maybe Spanish and Portuguese or Norwegian and Swedish or something, that there's not just going to be a word for word translation. One word in this language always necessarily means this other word in this other language. It doesn't work. And so you have to just do the best you can. And you're never going to understand Buddhism the way an ancient Indian Buddhist understood it, not only because of the language, but just because of the cultural conditioning. The whole way that you are conditioned to understand the world is going to be considerably different. So that is a kind of handicap, but you can, through understanding Dhamma, partly through your own practice, mainly, I hope, through your own practice, that you will get insights into what certain things mean, and then you can come up with your own words, like referring to karma as like the psychic or mental momentum of your mind. I had to come up with that on my own. I wasn't taught that by somebody else. It just makes sense to me. It seems to make better sense than some of the ancient Indian attempts to explain it, which are kind of metaphysical, almost magical, that the ancient Indian mind was more surreal, less objective, less philosophical in certain ways, less rational than like a modern Westerner is. So you have to make sense of things the best you can for yourself. And it's true that there are certain Pali words that are very difficult to translate in English, like dukkha, which is one reason why a lot of translators just leave dukkha untranslated. That there are a lot of Pali terms that are just left untranslated, much more so than in Christianity. Also, like karma. I mean, it's just become an English word. It just got accepted into the English language as it's, or Dhamma or Dharma. Again, it's just, there is no one word that is one Pali word, Dhamma. I mean, there just is no exact English equivalent for that. And so you either leave it untranslated or you just have to keep like investigating Dhamma, practicing it, getting insights into Dhamma that you get just sort of a feel for it. You grok it, as Robert Heinlein would say. You just get this intuitive understanding through your own experience. And so even if you don't have the exact word for it, still you have an appreciation for what it means. And you may just, the better you know Pali, you may just leave it untranslated in Pali. But even then, you're going to be understanding the Pali word with a modern Western mindset that still isn't going to be the same as the way an ancient Indian understood the word. So we just have to do the best we can. And it can be a handicap, but in certain ways, it can also be to our advantage, that you're not just locked in to a dogmatic approach where you're just memorizing explanations and thinking that you understand what the explanation is attempting to explain. So like the words for love in Pali, I mean, in English, you got pretty much the one word love. In Pali, you'd have different words for different kinds of love. Like in ancient Greek also, you had three different kinds of love. You had like agape, philos, and eros. It's kind of like that in Pali also. There's like sexual love or like emotional attachment kind of love. And then you got like the higher kind of love. And, there's just the language barrier is always going to be there whenever you're translating one language into another. And even if you are fairly good at translating the languages, still the whole way of thinking is going to be different, just due to cultural assumptions and so forth. So we just do the best we can. So let's see, where are the question marks? I got to find a question mark in this long question here so that I'll know exactly what the question is. See, how well does the translation of conscious and subconscious fare without having a wrong view as a Westerner? Well, from the Theravada Buddhist point of view, there is no subconscious mind to speak of. I mean, there's subtle events happening according to Abhidhamma, or rather the Abhidhamma commentaries, the Citta Vritti, that we're not consciously aware of because it happens so fast at this subliminal level. That might be called subconscious. Or, you've got the Bhavanga Citta that I mentioned in the previous Q&A, which is just sort of a static pattern that is in your mind when you're not thinking of anything in particular, like if you're in a deep sleep or something. But that doesn't really equate to like the Freudian concept of the subconscious or unconscious mind. And so that's just a whole different paradigm for understanding how the mind works. And that's one kind of advantage that a Westerner has, is we can be more eclectic and use different explanations of like how the mind works as a kind of triangulation. That you acknowledge, well, there's this way of like the ancient Indian way of understanding it. There's also the modern psychological way of understanding it. There's also this experiential way that I, as a modern Westerner, have like learned through my own practice. And then you can sort of combine and compare and contrast these different approaches that you can. I mean, if you've been a Catholic, you studied Catholicism, you might have like the official Catholic explanation of how the mind works and so forth. And so, I mean, in a way, it might make things more confusing, but also you're less locked into this dogma. And being locked into a dogma is not necessarily a good thing. Maybe for a beginner or a total normie, that dogmatism will at least, keep you pretty much on the straight and narrow and keep you away from like vile heresies and so forth. But you're going to be locked into it. I mean, it's not even really your understanding. You're just parroting somebody else's understanding, and their understanding might not have been all that great either. So, how well does the translation of conscious and subconscious fare without having a wrong view as a Westerner? That's the only question mark I see in this. So that is essentially the question. How well does the translation of conscious and subconscious fare without having a wrong view as a Westerner? Gosh. I mean, wrong view for a Westerner, it just comes to us. We're inevitably going to have a certain amount of wrong view. So, I mean, that's not so bad, because, I mean, the earliest Buddhism taught that you shouldn't have any view at all. So you shouldn't consider the ancient Indian view, which developed over time, as a kind of degeneration of Buddhism, really. That is something that is just gospel truth. That there is no explanation of reality in words that's going to be really gospel truth anyway. So all we can do is the best we can, and a modern Westerner can become enlightened, an ancient Indian can become enlightened, although the philosophical framework may be different, even though both might be Theravada Buddhists, simply because an ancient Indian is going to think differently from a modern Westerner, regardless of whether they're studying the same texts or anything like that, because the whole approach is going to be different. The starting assumptions are going to be different. Oh, wait, I see another question mark here. How much differences are there from the cultural semantics of a Western experience mind to an ancient Indian classic Buddhist experience and understanding of mind and mental state? Yeah, they're going to be different, and in some respects, the modern Westerner is going to have the advantage. Like, it's fairly obvious to me that there is a subconscious mind. It's like the symbolism of dreams, for example. Theravada Buddhism says almost nothing about dreams. Very little about dreams. They can't really explain the purpose of dreams, anything like that. So, to some degree, a modern Western attitude, even towards the mind, can help. I mean, you shouldn't just throw out all of early Buddhism, because then you're not even a Buddhist anymore. But still, you can use modern Western knowledge. Like, I use biology, like evolution, a Darwinian understanding of the human race. It's very helpful. It helps to explain human nature. That emotional responses, our instinctive behavior, human nature evolved for a purpose. It helped our species to survive. And then you can understand your own behavior a lot through understanding that. And the ancient Indians just didn't have that. They didn't have formal logic even, which, I mean, you can't really create truth through formal logic, but at least you can weed out a lot of bullshit. That a logical thinking is good as a kind of bullshit detector. You can detect really lame arguments that way, which ancient Indians, they did not have that luxury. But I'm not sure if I'm even answering this question, especially this last question. How well does the translation of conscious and subconscious fair without having a wrong view as a Westerner. Yeah, I think even the people, the ancient Indians who are developing like Abhidhamma philosophy, where they're making the difference between mind and mental states, consciousness and the various mental states that have to occur with consciousness. In a sense, I mean, they were having wrong view also. The Buddha really didn't teach that stuff. At least it's not in the suttas. A lot of it isn't. And a lot of it's not even in the Abhidhamma Pitaka. It's in the commentaries to the Abhidhamma. So, I mean, you shouldn't be too worried about that. I mean, if you study Dhamma and practice Dhamma, you'll get an idea of what Dhamma is about. And so you'll get an idea of where you can like use your own opinions as a way of understanding things when in certain cases you should just defer to what the suttas say. But I don't think that it's really the main problem for Westerners is, I mean, Western civilization is largely based on Greek, the ancient Greeks who were just like cerebral as fuck. They were just, they considered intellect to just be like the supreme power. And some ancient Greek philosophers considered like God to just be like this divine intellect. And so we really overestimate the power of the intellect in the West. And that is kind of a handicap for us. In a way, we can use the intellect to weed out bullshit arguments. That is good. You can use it to weed out really faulty reasoning that may be used in certain ancient texts for justifying a position, that kind of thing. But I even forgot how it even started, what exactly started me on that. How well does the translation of conscious and subconscious? Yeah, I mean, subconscious, I mean, there isn't even a word for it in Pali that I'm aware of. And even conscious, I mean, there's the word consciousness. There's various words like mano or chitta can mean consciousness. Like in Abhidhamma, mostly consciousness is vijnana, and they might be somewhat different connotations for those three terms. But really, I mean, we have to start with where we are. We can never, I learned this as a monk. I was trying to live like an ancient Indian ascetic. That was like my ideal. I was trying to live up to like the Sutta Nipata, live like the monks in ancient India. Didn't care about modern Burmese tradition, modern Thai tradition, didn't give a damn. I just wanted to be like an ancient Indian monk. And I eventually realized as a Western man that I just couldn't do it. I was going to be a Western man no matter what. I was going to be a modern Westerner that is trying to practice ancient Indian Buddhism and can get there to some degree, but you can't just erase Led Zeppelin and Gilligan's Island and Star Trek and Star Wars and all these experiences I've had in the modern world, just the whole like training in science, degree in biology. You can't just erase that and become an ancient Indian. So you just have to deal with what you've got, deal the hand that was dealt to you, or play the hand that was dealt to you as best you can. And I'm still not sure if I answered the question, but I spent plenty of time on it. So I guess I should move on to the next question. And this is from Indiana Dhamma. And Indiana Dhamma says, can you provide an update on the republishing of your Atthakavagga translation? Well, there was a person who contacted me and said that he was willing to reformat my Atthakavagga translation into a smaller size. And I think he's kind of disappeared. He's kind of disappeared off the face of the map. And so it may be that I'm going to have to reformat it myself. I have found there has been a donor who has volunteered to foot the bill for a new edition for free distribution. But still, the work has to be done for formatting. Like my idea from the very beginning is to have a small book that can fit into a pocket that you can carry around with you. You like go to a park and sit down under a tree. You can just pull out the Atthakavagga translation and just read from it. It'd be a small book, and I have to reformat that. So that's really the main thing. And then, of course, you have to find someone who's willing to publish the book. I don't want to do the Atthakavagga translation through Amazon because you can't do it without Amazon taking, money for doing it. And it should not be for sale. Even though I make no personal profit, I do not want it for sale for money. I mean, it may be, if I get an edition, that the people who want the book it would be helpful if they could like provide the postage for it. But I do not want the thing to be sold for money, if at all possible. But as I say, even though a donor has appeared who is willing to provide the funds for it, I have to reformat it, or else the person who offered to format it can reappear, or somebody else can offer to reformat it. So there is that, but it's going to happen after this book that I'm working on now, because I don't want to stop editing this one in order to start reformatting the other one. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Indiana Dhamma also. I have heard it said, I can't recall by whom, that Dhamma practice is like opening a window and hoping that the breeze of enlightenment comes through the window. It seems to me that the advice of the Atthakavagga is to demolish the entire house, stripping off one's garments and leaving nothing standing in the way of that enlightened breeze. Thoughts? Well, the person who said that Dhamma practice is like opening a window so that the breeze can blow in, but you can't force the breeze to blow in, so there is no guarantee. That would be J. Krishnamurti. That's where I got it anyway. And it's just a metaphor. I mean, you can take the metaphor more literally and say the Atthakavagga is you just demolish the entire house. But, I mean, Krishnamurti wasn't really talking about like a literal house either. I mean, he's just, you clean your room, you get your affairs in order, in whatever form that takes. You have the window open, and you cannot force the wind to blow in. There's no guarantee that you're going to become enlightened no matter how hard you practice, but at least you can be prepared for it. I mean, you can sort of get yourself ready for enlightenment. And in the Atthakavagga, very early Buddhism, they were very radical about it, much more radical than Krishnamurti, where, it's just extreme radical mysticism, where you are just stripping your life as bare as possible of any kind of content that can become a distraction. But to some degree, it's just, you shouldn't take like analogies too literally, because they will always break down. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is the last question. So we're going to be like 3.5 hours approximately on this one. And I've done 3.5 hour Q&As before. You guys are compensating for the small number of questions I received a few weeks ago. This is from Budo Pano, or Budo Pano, if there was supposed to be little squiggles over the last two N's. Budo Pano says, what did the Buddha proclaim about energy? What we know about energy is that it is neither created or destroyed, it just is. It's pretty clear that energy is in and out of all things, including us, and is a constant, therefore perhaps permanent. Can we also assume that Nibbana is also just an unmanifestation of energy, or perhaps energy itself? Thank you. And then he says, happy holidays and all the very best in the new year. So yeah, ho, ho, ho to all of you people. So this is sort of what I was talking about earlier in the long, rambling semi-answer to a question. It kind of applies to this also. What did the Buddha proclaim about energy? And really, the ancient Indian mind did not have the same understanding of energy that the modern scientific Western mind has. For example, I mean, there is a word that's sometimes translated as energy, which is virya, which is one of the 8 steps on the Noble Eightfold Path. No, that'd be right effort, which involves virya. But it's considered one of the 5 faculties, one of the 5 powers in like the suttas in Theravada philosophy, but it's like a mental energy. So, I mean, it's not the same as energy in physics. And the ancient Indian mind did not have this idea of just energy as energy in a physical or physics sense. For example, heat would be like tejo, or like fire element. In like ancient Indian philosophy, heat would be a manifestation of fire element. But movement, which also presumably from a Western point of view would be an example of energy, that would be wind element. And so fire element is some kind of energy, and wind element is another kind of energy. And then you've got the mental energies that, I mean, that they've got their own names too. It's not all identified as the same thing. So it's just a matter of different cultural approaches to essentially the same thing. And it's just not the same between, the ancient Ganges Valley and the modern scientific approach. So let's see, what did the Buddha proclaim about energy? He didn't proclaim anything about energy really in the physical sense, other than maybe attributing them to fire element or wind element or whatever, because that was just the cultural way of approaching those things in ancient India. With regard to mental energy, he had statements about mental energy, like virya is one of the five faculties or five powers, or, it's something that should be cultivated. You should have energy towards practicing Dhamma. But really, I mean, Buddhism is not about physics, trying to understand the world. I mean, the Abhidhamma scholars attempted it and didn't do a very good job, in my opinion, with regard to explaining, what we would explain with physics, science in general. So yeah, I mean, it's not a good match. The Buddha really did not make proclamations about energy in general, because energy in general was just not a concept, as far as I can tell, in ancient India. I mean, maybe like different philosophies like Sankhya might have like some primordial source of all energy. But in Buddhism, that's not the purpose of Buddhism. The purpose of Buddhism is not to explain the phenomenal world, at least not to explain it comprehensively. To give you enough understanding of it that you can detach from it and transcend it is one thing, but I mean, it's just not the purpose of it. So let's see. Let's see. What we know about energy is that it is neither created nor destroyed. It just is. It's pretty clear that energy is in and out of all things, including us, and is a constant, therefore perhaps permanent. Yeah, kind of, sort of. Except it's always changing. I mean, that's energy in general. I mean, it's different from one moment to the next, unless it's maybe potential energy. But even whatever is like storing the potential energy is going to be still changing from one moment to the next. So it's not going to be exactly the same from one moment to the next. Can we also assume that Nibbana is also just an unmanifestation? Well, no matter what you assume about Nibbana, it's going to be invalid. I mean, it's just, this is one of the weaknesses of the Western mind, is the Western mind, like I was already saying, it values intellect way beyond its worth. You cannot understand reality by thinking about it, period. It's not going to happen. I mean, you might be able to come up with some explanation for reality that satisfies you at least, but it might be good enough for your purposes, but it's not going to be ultimately valid. It's going to be delusional. And it's like people keep asking over and over again about, is Nibbana like this, or is Nibbana like that, or, what is the ultimate reality like, kind of stuff, these kind of questions. And it's just, you're never going to be able to explain it. The only way you're going to know what Nibbana is like is to experience it for yourself. And it's any idea you have about it is going to be invalid. To say that it exists is invalid. To say that it doesn't exist is invalid. To say that it does and doesn't exist is invalid. To say that it neither does nor does not exist is invalid. That words and ideas cannot touch reality. It's a kind of virtual reality created by perception. Perception is samsara. So any kind of perception you have is going to be samsaric. It's not going to be nibbana. It's not going to accurately represent nibbana. Nothing can accurately represent nibbana other than just experiencing it just pure and clear, in and of itself. So with regard to what the Buddha proclaimed about energy, the ancient Indians, at least ancient Buddhists, did not have the same idea of energy that we do. And so they didn't even have the concept of just plain energy. Different kinds of energy would be identified as different things. Heat is fire element. Movement is wind element. Both of those would be considered energy by a physicist, but not by an ancient Indian. So I guess I'm done. I guess I answered all the questions, or at least I tried to answer all the questions. There are some questions that are very difficult to answer. Sometimes because it's a very abstruse, subtle kind of a question. Other times I just don't understand what the question exactly is asking. But like I should always say at the beginning, and rarely ever do, if you have any questions you think I can answer, it's like especially about Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism, Buddhism in general, philosophy in general, spirituality in general, meditation in general, Burma, myself personally, etc. Feel free to ask, and please no more than 3 questions per video, because these videos can get pretty long. Just like 5 minutes per question for 40 questions is well over 3 hours. And I do try to do each question justice. I do try to give like an adequate, or at least my best attempt at an adequate answer. And so that's it. And Merry Christmas and ho, ho, ho. Happy Saturnalia. May you have an auspicious Saturnalia and be happy. And now I got to push the stop button.